Book 3, Chapters 4 through 6 of The Wars of the Jews. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Chapter 6. Placidus attempts to take Jotapata and is beaten off. Vespasian marches into Galilee. And now Vespasian, with his son Titus, had tarried some time at Ptolemais, and had put his army in order. But when Placidus, who had overrun Galilee, and had besides slain a number of those whom he had caught, which were only the weaker part of the Galileans, and such as were of timorous souls, saw that the warriors ran always to those cities with walls that had been built by Josephus, he marched furiously against Jotapata, which was of them all the strongest, as supposing he should easily take it by a sudden surprise, and that he should thereby obtain great honor to himself among the commanders, and bring a great advantage to them in their future campaign, because if this strongest place of them all were once taken, the rest would be so affrighted as to surrender themselves. But he was mightily mistaken in his undertaking, for the men of Jotapata were apprised of his coming to attack them, and came out of the city and expected him there. So they fought the Romans briskly when they least expected it, being both many in number and prepared for fighting, and of great alacrity, as esteeming their country, their wives, and their children to be in danger, and easily put the Romans to flight, and wounded many of them, and slew 7 of them. Because their retreat was not made in a disorderly manner, because the strokes only touched the surface of their bodies, which were covered with their armor in all parts, and because the Jews did rather throw their weapons upon them from a great distance than venture to come hand to hand with them, and had only light armor on, while the others were completely armored. However, 3 men of the Jews' side were slain, and a few wounded. So Placidus, finding himself unable to assault the city, ran away. But as Vespasian had a great mind to fall upon Galilee, he marched out of Ptolemais, having put his army into that order wherein the Romans used to march. He ordered those auxiliaries which were lightly armed, and the archers, to march first, that they might prevent any sudden insults from the enemy, and might search out the woods that looked suspiciously and were capable of ambuscades. Next to these followed that part of the Romans which was completely armed, both footmen and horsemen. Next to these followed 10 of every 100, carrying along with them their arms and what was necessary to measure out a camp withal, and after them such as were to make the road even and straight, and if it were anywhere rough and hard to be passed over, to plane it, and to cut down the woods that hindered their march, that the army might not be in distress or tired with their march. Behind these he set such carriages of the army as belonged both to himself and to the other commanders, with a considerable number of their horsemen for their security. After these he marched himself, having with him a select body of footmen and horsemen and pikemen. After these came the peculiar cavalry of his own legion, for there were 120 horsemen that peculiarly belonged to every legion. Next to these came the mules that carried the engines for sieges, and the other warlike machines of that nature. After these came the commanders of the cohorts and tribunes, having about them soldiers chosen out of the rest. Then came the ensigns encompassing the eagle, which is at the head of every Roman legion, the king and the strongest of all birds, which seems to them a signal of dominion, and an omen that they shall conquer all against whom they march. These sacred ensigns are followed by the trumpeters. Then came the main army in their squadrons and battalions, with 6 men in depth, which were followed at last by a centurion, who, according to custom, observed the rest. As for the servants of every legion, they all followed the footmen, and led the baggage of the soldiers, which was borne by the mules and other beasts of burden. But behind all the legions came the whole multitude of the mercenaries, and those that brought up the rear came last of all for the security of the whole army, being both footmen, and those in their armor also, with a great number of horsemen. And thus did Vespasian march with his army, and came to the bounds of Galilee, where he pitched his camp, and restrained his soldiers who were eager for war. He also showed his army to the enemy, in order to affright them, and to afford them a season for repentance, to see whether they would change their minds before it came to battle. And at the same time he got things ready for besieging their strong minds. And indeed, this sight of the general brought many to repent of their revolt, and put them all into a consternation. For those that were in Josephus's camp, which was at the city called Garus, not far from Sepphoris, when they heard that the war was come near them, and that the Romans would suddenly fight them hand to hand, dispersed themselves and fled, not only before they came to a battle, but before the enemy ever came in sight, while Josephus and a few others were left behind. And as he saw that he had not an army sufficient to engage the enemy, that the spirits of the Jews were sunk, and that the greater part would willingly come to terms, if they might be credited, he already despaired of the success of the whole war, and determined to get as far as he possibly could out of danger. So he took those that stayed among with him, and fled to Tiberias. Book 3, Chapter 7, Part 1 of the Wars of the Jews. Chapter 7. Vespasian, when he had taken the city Judea, marches to Jotapata. After a long siege, the city is betrayed by a deserter, and taken by Vespasian. So Vespasian marched to the city Judea, and took it upon the first onset, because he found it destitute of any considerable number of men grown up and fit for war. He came then into it, and slew all the youth, the Romans having no mercy on any age whatsoever. And this was done out of the hatred they bore for the nation, and because of the iniquity they had been guilty of in the affair with Cestius. He also set fire not only to the city itself, but to all the villas and small cities that were round about it. Some of them were quite destitute of inhabitants, and out of some of them he carried the inhabitants as slaves into captivity. As to Josephus, his retiring to that city, which he chose as the most fit for his security, put it into great fear. For the people of Tiberias did not imagine that he would have run away unless he had entirely despaired of the success of the war. And indeed, as to that point, they were not mistaken about his opinion, for he saw whither the affairs of the Jews would tend at last, and was sensible that they had but one way of escaping, and that was by repentance. However, although he expected that the Romans would forgive him, yet did he choose to die many times over rather than betray his country, and to disarm that supreme command of the army which had been entrusted with him, or to live happily under those against whom he was sent to fight. He determined, therefore, to give an exact account of affairs to the principal men at Jerusalem by a letter, that he might not, by too much aggrandizing the power of the enemy, make them too timorous, nor by relating that their power beneath the truth might encourage them to stand out, when they were perhaps disposed to repentance. He also sent them word that if they thought of coming to terms, they must suddenly write him an answer, or if they resolved upon war, they must send him an army sufficient to fight the Romans. Accordingly, he wrote these things, and sent messengers immediately to carry his letter to Jerusalem. Now Vespasian was very desirous of demolishing Jotapata, for he had gotten intelligence that the greatest part of the enemy had retired thither, and that it was, on other accounts, a place of great security to them. Accordingly, he sent both footmen and horsemen to level the road, which was mountainous and rocky, not without difficulty to be traveled over by footmen, but absolutely impracticable for horsemen. Now these workmen accomplished what they were about in 4 days' time, and opened a broad way for the army. On the 5th day, which was the 21st of the month Artemisius, Gr, Josephus prevented him, and came from Tiberias, and went into Jotapata, and raised the drooping spirits of the Jews. And a certain deserter told this good news to Vespasian, that Josephus had removed himself thither, which made him make haste to the city, as supposing that with taking that he should take all Judea, in case he could but withal get Josephus under his power. So he took this news to be of the vastest advantage to him, and believed it to be brought about by the providence of God, that he who appeared to be the most prudent man of all their enemies had, of his own accord, shut himself up in a place of sure custody. Accordingly, he sent Placidus with 1,000 horsemen, and Ebutius, a decurion, a person that was of eminency both in counsel and in action, to encompass the city round, that Josephus might not escape away privately. Vespasian also, the very next day, took his whole army and followed them, and by marching till late in the evening, arrived then at Jotapata. And bringing his army to the northern side of the city, he pitched his camp on a certain small hill which was 7 furlongs from the city, and still greatly endeavored to be well seen by the enemy, to put them into a consternation. which was indeed so terrible to the Jews immediately that no one of them durst go out beyond the wall. Yet did the Romans put off the attack at that time, because they had marched all the day, although they placed a double row of battalions round the city, with a third row beyond them round the whole, which consisted of cavalry, in order to stop up every way for an exit, which thing, making the Jews despair of escaping, excited them to act more boldly, for nothing makes men fight so desperately in war as necessity. Now when the next day an assault was made by the Romans, the Jews at first stayed out of the walls and opposed them, and met them as having formed themselves a camp before the city walls. But when Vespasian had set against them the archers and slingers, and the whole multitude that could throw to a great distance, he permitted them to go to work, while he himself, with the footmen, got upon an acclivity, whence the city might easily be taken. Josephus was then in fear for the city, and leaped out, and all the Jewish multitude with him. These fell together upon the Romans in great numbers, and drove them away from the wall, and performed a great many glorious and bold actions. Yet did they suffer as much as they made the enemy suffer. For as despair of deliverance encouraged the Jews, so did a sense of shame equally encourage the Romans. These last had skill as well as strength. The other had only courage, which armed them and made them fight furiously. And when the fight had lasted all day, it was put an end to by the coming on of the night. They had wounded a great many of the Romans, and killed of them 13 men. Of the Jews' side 17 were slain, and 600 wounded. On the next day the Jews made another attack upon the Romans, and went out of the walls, and fought a much more desperate battle with them than before, for they were now become more courageous than formerly, and that on account of the unexpected good opposition they had made the day before, as they found the Romans also to fight more desperately. For a sense of shame inflamed these into a passion, as estimating their failure of a sudden victory to be a kind of defeat. Thus did the Romans try to make an impression upon the Jews till the 5th day continually, while the people of Jotapata made sallies out, and fought at the walls most desperately. Nor were the Jews affrighted at the strength of the enemy, nor were the Romans discouraged at the difficulties they met with in taking the city. Now Jotapata is almost all of it built on a precipice, having on all the other sides of it every way valleys immensely deep and steep, insomuch that those who would look down would have their sight fail them before it reaches the bottom. It is only to be come at on the north side, where the utmost part of the city is built on the mountain, as it ends obliquely at a plain. This mountain Josephus had encompassed with a wall when he fortified the city, that its top might not be capable of being seized upon by the enemies. The city is covered all round with other mountains, and can no way be seen till a man comes just upon it, and this was the strong situation of Jotapata. Vespasian, therefore, in order to try how he might overcome the natural strength of the place, as well as the bold defense of the Jews, made a resolution to prosecute the siege with vigor. To that end he called the commanders that were under him to a council of war, and consulted with them which way the assault might be managed to the best advantage. And when the resolution was there taken to raise a bank against that part of the wall which was practicable, he sent his whole army abroad to get the materials together. So when they had cut down all the trees on the mountains that adjoined the city, and gotten together a vast heap of stones, besides the wood they had cut down, some of them brought hurdles, in order to avoid the effects of the darts that were shot from above them. These hurdles they spread over their banks, under cover whereof they formed their bank, and so were little or nothing hurt by the darts that were thrown upon them from the wall, while others pulled the neighboring hillocks to pieces, and perpetually brought earth to them, so that while they were busy 3 sorts of ways, nobody was idle. However, the Jews cast great stones from the walls upon the hurdles which protected the men, with all sorts of darts also, and the noise of what could not reach them was yet so terrible that it was some impediment to the workmen. Vespasian then set the engines for throwing stones and darts round about the city. The number of the engines was in all 160, and he bid them fall to work, and dislodge those that were upon the wall. At the same time such engines as were intended for that purpose threw at once lances upon them with a great noise, and stones of the weight of a talent were thrown by the engines that were prepared for that purpose, together with fire and a vast multitude of arrows, which made the wall so dangerous that the Jews durst not only not come upon it, but durst not come to those parts within the walls which were reached by the engines. For the multitude of the Arabian archers, as well also as all those that threw darts and slung stones, fell to work at the same time with the engines. Yet did not the otters lie still, when they could not throw at the Romans from a higher place, for they then made sallies out of the city, like private robbers, by parties, and pulled away the hurdles that covered the workmen, and killed them when they were thus naked. And when those workmen gave way, these cast away the earth that composed the bank, and burnt the wooden parts of it, together with the hurdles, till at length Vespasian perceived that the intervals there were between the works were of disadvantage to him, for those spaces of ground afforded the Jews a place for assaulting the Romans. So he united the hurdles, and at the same time joined one part of the army to the other, which prevented the private excursions of the Jews. And when the bank was now raised, and brought nearer than ever to the battlements that belonged to the walls, Josephus thought it would be entirely wrong in him if he could make no contrivances in opposition to theirs, and that might not be for the city's preservation. So he got together his workmen, and ordered them to build the wall higher. And while they said this was impossible to be done, while so many darts were thrown at them, he invented this sort of cover for them. He built them fixed piles, and expand before them the raw hides of oxen newly killed, that these hides, by yielding and hollowing themselves when the stones were thrown at them, might receive them, for that the other darts would slide off of them, and the fire that was thrown would be quenched by the moisture that was in them. And these he set before the workmen, and under them these workmen went on with their works in safety, and raised the wall higher, and that both by day and by night, full it was 20 cubits high. He also built a good number of towers upon the wall, and fitted it to strong battlements. This greatly discouraged the Romans, who in their own opinions were already gotten within the walls, while they were now at once astonished at Josephus's contrivance, and at the fortitude of the citizens that were in the city. And now Vespasian was plainly irritated at the great subtlety of this stratagem, and at the boldness of the citizens of Jotapata. For taking heart again upon the building of this wall, they made fresh sallies upon the Romans, and had every day conflicts with them by parties, together with all such contrivances as robbers make use of, and with the plundering of all that came to hand, also with the setting of fire to all the other works. And this till Vespasian made his army leave off fighting them, and resolved to lie round the city, and to starve them into a surrender, as supposing that either they would be forced to petition him for mercy by want of provisions, or if they should have the courage to hold out to the last, they should perish by famine. And he concluded he should conquer them the more easily in fighting, if he gave them an interval, and then fell upon them when they were weakened by famine. But still he gave orders that they should guard against their coming out of the city. Now the besieged had plenty of corn within the city, and indeed of all necessities, but they wanted water, because there was no fountain in the city, the people being there usually satisfied with rainwater. Yet it is a rare thing in that country to have rain in summer. And at this season, during the siege, they were in great distress for some contrivance to satisfy their thirst. And they were very sad at this time particularly, as if they were already in want of water entirely. For Josephus, seeing that the city abounded with other necessaries, and that the men were of good courage, and being desirous to protract the siege to the Romans longer than they expected, ordered their drink to be given to them by measure. But this scanty distribution of water by measure was deemed by them as a thing more hard upon them than the want of it. And their not being able to drink as much as they would made them more desirous of drinking than they otherwise had been. Nay, they were as much disheartened hereby as if they were come to the last degree of thirst. Nor were the Romans unacquainted with the state they were in, for when they stood over against them beyond the wall, they could see them running together and taking their water by measure, which made them throw their javelins thither, the place being within their reach, and kill a great many of them. Hereupon Vespasian hoped that their receptacles of water would in no long time be emptied, and that they would be forced to deliver up the city to him. But Josephus, being minded to break such his hope, gave command that they should wet a great many of their clothes, and hang them out about the battlements, till the entire wall was of a sudden all wet with the running down of water. At this sight the Romans were discouraged, and under consternation, when they saw them able to throw away in sport so much water, when they supposed them not to have enough to drink themselves. This made the Roman general despair of taking the city by their want of necessaries, and betake himself again to arms, and to try to force them to surrender, which was what the Jews greatly desired. For as they despaired of either themselves or their city being able to escape, they preferred a death in battle before won by hunger and thirst. However, Josephus contrived another stratagem besides the foregoing to get plenty of what they wanted. There was a certain rough and uneven place that could hardly be ascended, and on that account was not guarded by the soldiers. So Josephus sent out certain persons along the western parts of the valley, and by them sent letters to whom he pleased of the Jews that were out of the city, and procured from them what necessities soever they wanted in the city in abundance. He enjoined them also to creep generally along by the watch as they came into the city, and to cover their backs with such sheepskins as had their wool upon them, that if any one should spy them out in the night time, they might be believed to be dogs. This was done till the watch perceived their contrivance, and encompassed that rough place about themselves. And now it was that Josephus perceived that the city could not hold out long, and that his own life would be in doubt if he continued in it. So he consulted how he and the most potent men of the city might fly out of it. When the multitude understood this, they came all round about him, and begged of him not to overlook them when they entirely depended on him and him alone, for that there was still hope of the city's deliverance if he would stay with them, because everybody would undertake any pains with great cheerfulness on his account, and in that case there would be some comfort for them also, though they should be taken, that it became him neither to fly from his enemies, nor to desert his friends, nor to leap out of that city, as out of a ship that was sinking in a storm, into which he came when it was quiet and in a calm. For that by going away he would be the cause of drowning the city, because nobody would then venture to oppose the enemy when he was once gone, upon whom they wholly confided. Hereupon Josephus avoided letting them know that he was to go away to provide for his own safety, but told them that he would go out of the city for their sakes, for that if he stayed with them he should be able to do them little good while they were in a safe condition, and that if they were once taken, he should only perish with them to no purpose, but that if he were once gotten free from this siege, he should be able to bring them very great relief, for that he would then immediately get the Galileans together out of the country in great multitudes, and draw the Romans off their city by another war. That he did not see what advantage he could bring to them now by staying among them, but only provoke the Romans to besiege them more closely, as esteeming it a more valuable thing to take him, but that if they were once informed that he was fled out of the city, they would greatly remit of their eagerness against it. Yet did not this plea move the people, but inflamed them the more to hang about him. Accordingly both the children and the old men and the women with their infants came mourning to him, and fell down before him, and all of them caught hold of his feet, and held him fast, and besought him with great lamentations that he would take his share with them in their fortune. And I think they did this, not that they envied his deliverance, but that they hoped for their own. For they could not think they should suffer any great misfortune, provided Josephus would but stay with them. Now Josephus thought that if he resolved to stay, it would be ascribed to their entreaties, and if he resolved to go away by force, he should be put into custody. His commiseration also of the people under their lamentations had much broken that his eagerness to leave them. So he resolved to stay, and arming himself with the common despair of the citizens, he said to them, "Now is the time to begin to fight in earnest, where there is no hope of deliverance left. it is a brave thing to prefer glory before life, and to set about some such noble undertaking as may be remembered by late posterity." Having said this, he fell to work immediately, and made a sally, and dispersed the enemy's outguards, and ran as far as the Roman camp itself, and pulled the coverings of their tents to pieces that were upon their banks, and set fire to their works. And this was the manner in which he never left off fighting, neither the next day nor the day after it, but went on with it for a considerable number, both days and nights. Upon this, Vespasian, when he saw the Romans distressed by these sallies, though they were ashamed to be made to run away by the Jews, and when at any time they made the Jews run away, their heavy armor would not let them pursue them far, while the Jews, when they had performed any action, and before they could be hurt themselves, still retired into the city, ordered his armed men to avoid their onset, and not fight it out with men under desperation, while nothing is more courageous than despair, but that their violence would be quenched when they saw they failed of their purposes, as fire is quenched when it wants fuel, and that it was proper for the Romans to gain their victories as cheap as they could, since they are not forced to fight, but only to enlarge their dominions. So he repelled the Jews in great measure by the Arabian archers and the Syrian slingers, and by those that threw stones at them, nor was there any intermission of the great number of their offensive engines. Now the Jews suffered greatly by these engines, without being able to escape from them. And when these engines threw their stones or javelins a great way, and the Jews were within their reach, they pressed hard upon the Romans, and fought desperately, without sparing either soul or body, one part succoring another by turns, when it was tired down. When therefore Vespasian looked upon himself as in a manner besieged by these sallies of the Jews, and when his banks were now not far from the walls, he determined to make use of his battering ram. This battering ram is a vast beam of wood, like the mast of a ship. Its forepart is armed with a thick piece of iron at the head of it, which is so carved as to be like the head of a ram, whence its name is taken. This ram is slung in the air by ropes passing over its middle, and is hung like the balance in a pair of scales from another beam, and braced by strong beams that pass on both sides of it, in the nature of a cross. When this ram is pulled backward by a great number of men with united force, and then thrust forward by the same men with a mighty noise, it batters the walls with that iron part which is prominent. Nor is there any tower so strong, or wall so broad, that can resist more than its first batteries, but all are forced to yield to it at last. This was the experiment which the Roman general betook himself to, when he was eagerly bent upon taking the city, but found lying in the field so long to be to his disadvantage, because the Jews would never let him be quiet. So these Romans brought the several engines for galling an enemy nearer to the walls, that they might reach such as were upon the wall, and endeavor to frustrate their attempts. These threw stones and javelins at them. In the like manner did the archers and slingers come both together closer to the wall. This brought matters to such a pass that none of the Jews durst mount the walls. And then it was that the other Romans brought the battering ram, that was cased with hurdles all over, and in the tipper part was secured by skins that covered it, and this both for the security of themselves and of the engine. Now at the very first stroke of this engine the wall was shaken, and a terrible clamor was raised by the people within the city, as if they were already taken. And now, when Josephus saw this ram still battering the same place, and that the wall would quickly be thrown down by it, he resolved to elude for a while the force of the engine. With this design he gave orders to fill sacks with chaff, and to hang them down before that place where they saw the ram always battering, that the stroke might be turned aside, or that the place might feel less of the strokes by the yielding nature of the chaff. This contrivance very much delayed the attempts of the Romans, because, let them remove their engine to what part they pleased, Those that were above it removed their sacks, and placed them over against the strokes it made, insomuch that the wall was in no way hurt. And this by diversion of the strokes, till the Romans made an opposite contrivance of long poles, and by tying hooks at their ends, cut off the sacks. Now when the battering ram thus recovered its force, and the wall, having been but newly built, was giving way, Josephus and those about him had afterwards immediate recourse to fire, to defend themselves withal. Whereupon they took what materials soever they had that were but dry, and made a sally 3 ways, and set fire to the machines, and the hurdles, and the banks of the Romans themselves. Nor did the Romans well know how to come to their assistance, being at once under a consternation at the Jews' boldness, and being prevented by the flames from coming to their assistance. For the materials being dry with the bitumen and pitch that were among them, as was brimstone also, the fire caught hold of everything immediately, and what cost the Romans a great deal of pains was in 1 hour consumed. Book 3, Chapter 7, Part 2 of the Wars of the Jews. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Book 3, Chapter 7, Part 2. And here a certain Jew appeared, worthy of our relation and commendation. He was the son of Samius, and was called Eleazar, and was born at Sab in Galilee. This man took up a stone of vast bigness, and threw it down from the wall upon the ram, and this with so great a force that it broke off the head of the engine. He also leaped down, and took up the head of the ram from the midst of them, and without any concern carried it to the top of the wall, and this while he stood as a fit mark to be pelted by all his enemies. Accordingly he received the strokes upon his naked body, and was wounded with 5 darts. Nor did he mind any of them while he went up to the top of the wall, where he stood in the sight of them all, as an instance of the greatest boldness. After which he drew himself on a heap with his wounds upon him, and fell down together with the head of the ram. Next to him 2 brothers showed their courage. Their names were Netir and Philip, both of them of the village of Ruma, and both of them Galileans also. These men leaped upon the soldiers of the 10th Legion, and fell upon the Romans with such a great noise and force as to disorder their ranks, and put to flight all upon whomever they made their assaults. After these men's performances, Josephus and the rest of the multitude with him took a great deal of fire, and burnt both the machines and their coverings, with the works belonging to the 5th and to the 10th Legion, which they put to flight, when others followed them immediately, and burned those instruments and all their materials underground. However, about the evening, the Romans erected the battering ram again, against that part of the wall which had suffered before, where a certain Jew that defended the city from the Romans hit Vespasian with a dart in his foot, and wounded him a little, the distance being so great that no mighty impression could be made by the dart thrown so far off. However, this caused the greatest disorder amongst the Romans. For when those who stood near him saw his blood, they were disturbed at it, and a report went abroad through the whole army that the general was wounded, while the greatest part left the siege, and came running together with surprise and fear to the general. And before them all came Titus, out of the concern that he had for his father, insomuch that the multitude were in great confusion, and this out of the regard that they had for their general, and by reason of the agony that the son was in. Yet did the father put an end to the son's fear and to the disorder the army was under, for being superior to his pains, and endeavoring soon to be seen by all that had been in a fright about him, he excited them to fight the Jews more briskly. For now everybody was willing to expose himself to danger immediately in order to avenge their general, and then they encouraged one another with loud voices, and ran hastily to the walls. But still Josephus and those with him, although they fell down dead one upon another by the darts and stones which the engines threw upon them, yet did not they desert the wall, but fell upon those who managed the ram, under the protection of the hurdles, with fire and iron weapons and stones. And these could do little or nothing, but fell themselves perpetually, while they were seen by those whom they could not see, for the light of their own flame shone about them, and made them a most visible mark to the enemy. as they were in the daytime, while the engines could not be seen at a great distance, and so what was thrown at them was hard to be avoided, for the force with which these engines threw stones and darts made them hurt several at a time, and the violent noise of the stones that were cast by the engines was so great that they carried away the pinnacles of the wall and broke off the corners of the towers, for no body of men could be so strong as not to be overthrown to the last rank by the largeness of the stones. And anyone may learn the force of the engines by what happened this very night. For as one of those that stood round about Josephus was near the wall, his head was carried away by such a stone, and his skull was flung as far as 3 furlongs. In the daytime also a woman with child had her belly so violently struck, as she was just come out of her house, that the infant was carried to the distance of 1/2 furlong, so great was the force of that engine. The noise of the instruments themselves was very terrible. The sound of the darts and stones that were thrown by them was so also. Of the same sort was that noise the dead bodies made when they were dashed against the wall. And indeed dreadful was the clamor which these things raised in the women within the city, which was echoed back at the same time by the cries of such as were slain, while the whole space of ground whereupon they fought ran with blood, and the wall might have been ascended over the bodies of the dead carcasses. The mountains also contributed to the increase of the noise by their echoes. Nor was there on that night anything of terror wanting that could either affect the hearing or the sight. Yet did a great part of those that fought so hard for Jotapata fall manfully, as were a great part of them wounded. However, the morning watch was come ere the wall yielded to the machines employed against it, though it had been battered without intermission. However, those within covered their bodies with their armor, and raised works over against that part which was thrown down, before those machines were laid, by which the Romans were to ascend into the city. In the morning Vespasian got his army together, in order to take the city by storm, after a little recreation upon the hard pains they had been at the night before, and as he was desirous to draw off those that opposed him from the places where the wall had been thrown down, he made the most courageous of the horsemen get off their horses, and place them in 3 ranks over against those ruins of the wall, but covered with their armor on every side, with poles in their hands, that so these might begin their ascent as soon as the instruments for such ascent were laid. Behind them he placed the flower of the footmen, but for the rest of the horse he ordered them to extend themselves over against the wall, upon the whole hilly country, in order to prevent any from escaping out of the city when it should be taken. And behind these he placed the archers round about, and commanded them to have their darts ready to shoot. The same command he gave to the slingers, and to those that managed the engines, and bid them to take up other ladders, and have them ready to lay upon those parts of the wall which were yet untouched, that the besieged might be engaged in trying to hinder their ascent by them, and leave the guard of the parts that were thrown down, while the rest of them should be overborne by the darts cast at them, and might afford his men an entrance into the city. But Josephus, understanding the meaning of Vespasian's contrivance, set the old men, together with those that were tired out, at the sound parts of the wall, as expecting no harm from those quarters, but set the strongest of his men at the place where the wall was broken down, and before them all 6 men by themselves, among whom he took his share of the first and greatest danger. He also gave orders that when the legion made a shout, they should stop their ears, that they might not be affrighted at it, and that to avoid the multitude of the enemy's darts they should bend down on their knees and cover themselves with their shields, and that they should retreat a little backward for a while, till the archers should have emptied their quivers. But that when the Romans should lay their instruments for ascending the walls, they should leap out on the sudden, and with their own instruments should meet the enemy, and that everyone should strive to do his best, in order not to defend his own city, as if it were possible to be preserved, but in order to revenge it when it was already destroyed, and that they should set before their eyes how their old men were to be slain, and their children and wives were to be killed immediately by the enemy, and that they would beforehand spend all their fury on account of the calamities just coming upon them, and pour it out on the actors. And thus did Josephus dispose of both his bodies of men. But then, for the useless part of the citizens, the women and children, when they saw their city encompassed by a 3-fold army, for none of the usual guards that had been fighting before were removed, when they also saw not only the walls thrown down, but their enemies with swords in their hands, as also the hilly country above them shining with their weapons, and the darts in the hands of the Arabian archers, they made a final and lamentable outcry of the destruction, as if the misery were not only threatened, but actually come upon them already. But Josephus ordered the women to be shut up in their houses, lest they should render the warlike actions of the men too effeminate by making them commiserate their condition, and commanded them to hold their peace, and threatened them if they did not, while he came himself before the breach where his allotment was. For all those who brought ladders to the other places, he took no notice of them, but earnestly waited for the shower of arrows that was coming. And now the trumpeters of the several Roman legions sounded together, and the army made a terrible shout, and the darts, as by order, flew so fast that they intercepted the light. However, Josephus's men remembered the charges he had given them. They stopped their ears at the sounds, and covered their bodies against the darts. And as to the engines that were set ready to go to work, the Jews ran out upon them, before those that should have used them were gotten upon them. And now, on the ascending of the soldiers, there was a great conflict, and many actions of the hands and of the soul were exhibited, while the Jews did earnestly endeavor, in the extreme danger they were in, not to show less courage than those who, without being in danger, fought so stoutly against them. Nor did they leave struggling with the Romans till they either fell down dead themselves, or killed their antagonists. But the Jews grew weary with defending themselves continually, and had not enough to come in their places and succor them, while on the side of the Romans fresh men still succeeded those that were tired, and still new men soon got upon the engines for ascent, in the room of those that were thrust down, those encouraging one another, and joining side to side with their shields, which were a protection to them, they became a body of men not to be broken. And as this band thrust away the Jews, as though they were themselves but one body, they began already to get upon the wall. Then did Josephus take necessity for his counselor in this utmost distress, which necessity is very sagacious in invention when it is irritated by despair, and gave orders to pour scalding oil upon those whose shields protected them, whereupon they soon got it ready, being many that brought it, and what they brought being a great quantity also, and poured it on all sides upon the Romans, and threw down upon them their vessels, as they were still hissing from the heat of the fire. This so burnt the Romans that it dispersed that united band, which now tumbled down from the wall with horrid pains, for the oil did easily run down the whole body from head to foot under their armor, and fed upon their flesh like flame itself, its fat and unctuous nature rendering it soon heated and slowly cool. And as the men were cooped up in their headpieces and breastplates, they could no way get free from this burning oil. They could only leap and roll about in their pains, as they fell down from the bridges they had laid. And as they thus were beaten back and retired to their own party, who still pressed them forward, they were easily wounded by those behind them. However, in this ill success of the Romans, their courage did not fail them, nor did the Jews want prudence to oppose them, for the Romans, although they saw their own men thrown down and in a miserable condition, yet were they vehemently bent upon those that poured the oil upon them, while every one reproached the man before him as a coward, and one that hindered him from exerting himself, and while the Jews made use of another stratagem to prevent their ascent, and poured boiling fenugreek upon the boards, in order to make them slip and fall down, by which means neither could those that were coming up, nor those that were going down, stand upon their feet. But some of them fell backward upon the machines on which they ascended, and were trodden down. Many of them fell down upon the bank they had raised, and when they were fallen upon it, were slain by the Jews. For when the Romans could not keep their feet, the Jews, being freed from fighting hand to hand, had leisure to throw their darts upon them. So the general called off these soldiers in the evening that had suffered so sorely, of whom the number of the slain was not a few, while that of the wounded was still greater. But of the people of Jotapata no more than 6 men were killed, although more than 300 were carried off wounded. This fight happened on the 20th day of the month of Decius, Sivan. Hereupon Vespasian comforted his army on occasion of what happened, and as he found them angry indeed, but rather wanting somewhat to do than any further exhortations, he gave orders to raise the banks still higher, and to erect 3 towers, each 50 feet high, and that they should cover them with plates of iron on every side, that they might be both firm by their weight and not easily liable to be set on fire. These towers he set upon the banks, and placed upon them such as could shoot darts and arrows, with the lighter engines for throwing stones and darts also. And besides these he set upon them the stoutest men among the slingers, who not being to be seen by reason of the height they stood upon, and the battlements that protected them, might throw their weapons at those that were still upon the wall, and were easily seen by them. Hereupon the Jews, not being easily able to escape those darts that were thrown down upon their heads, nor to avenge themselves on those whom they could not see, and perceiving that the height of the towers was so great that a dart which they threw with their hand could easily reach it, and that the iron plates about them made it very hard to come at them by fire, they ran away from the walls, and fled hastily out of the city, and fell upon those that shot at them. And thus did the people of Jotapata resist the Romans, while a great number of them were every day killed, without their being able to retort the evil upon their enemies, nor could they keep them out of the city without danger to themselves. At this time it was that Vespasian sent out Trajan against a city called Jaffa, that lay near to Jotapata, and that desired innovations, and was puffed up with the unexpected length of the opposition of Jotapata. This Trajan was the commander of the 10th legion, and to him Vespasian committed 1,000 horsemen and 2,000 footmen. When Trajan came to the city, he found it hard to be taken, for besides the natural strength of its situation, it was also secured by a double wall. But when he saw the people of the city coming out of it, and ready to fight him, he joined battle with them, and after a short resistance which they made, he pursued after them, and as they fled to their first wall, the Romans followed so closely that they fell in together with them. But when the Jews were endeavoring to get again within their second wall, their fellow citizens shut them out, as being afraid that the Romans would force themselves in with them. It was certainly God, therefore, who brought the Romans to punish the Galileans, and did then expose the people of the city, every one of them, manifestly to be destroyed by their bloody enemies. For when they fell upon the gates in great crowds, and earnestly calling to those that kept them, and that by their names also, yet had they their throats cut in the very midst of their supplications. For the enemy shut the gates of the first wall, and their own citizens shut the gates of the second, so that they were enclosed between 2 walls, and were slain in great numbers together. Many of them were run through by swords of their own men, and many by their own swords, besides an immense number that were slain by the Romans. Nor had they any courage to revenge themselves, for there was added to the consternation they were in from the enemy their being betrayed by their own friends, which quite broke their spirits. And at last they died, cursing not the Romans, but their own citizens, till they were all destroyed, being in number 12,000. So Trajan gathered that the city was empty of people that could fight, and although there should a few of them be therein, he supposed that they would be too timorous to venture upon any opposition. So he reserved the taking of the city to the general. Accordingly he sent messengers to Vespasian, and desired him to send his son Titus to finish the victory he had gained. Vespasian, hereupon imagining there might be some pain still necessary, sent his son with an army of 500 horsemen and 1,000 footmen. So he came quickly to the city, and put his army in order, and sent Trajan over the left wing, while he had the right wing himself, and led them to the siege. And when the soldiers brought ladders to be laid against the wall on every side, the Galileans opposed them from above for a while, but soon afterwards they left the walls. Then did Titus's men leap into the city, and seized upon it presently. But when those that were in it were gotten together, there was a fierce battle between them. For the men of power fell upon the Romans in the narrow streets, and the women threw whatsoever came next to hand at them, and sustained a fight with them for 6 hours' time. But when the fighting men were spent, the rest of the multitude had their throats cut, partly in the open air, and partly in their own houses, both young and old together. So there were no males now remaining besides infants, which, with the women, were carried as slaves into captivity. So that the number of the slain, both now in the city and at the former fight, was 15,000, and the captives were 2,130. This calamity befell the Galileans on the 25th day of the month of Decius, Sivan. Nor did the Samaritans escape their share of misfortunes at this time, for they assembled themselves together on a mountain called Gerizim, which is with them a holy mountain, and there remained, which collection of theirs, as well as the courageous minds they showed, could not but threaten somewhat of war. Nor were they rendered wiser by the miseries that came upon their neighboring cities. They also, notwithstanding the great success the Romans had, marched on in an unreasonable manner, depending on their own weakness, and were disposed for any tumult upon its first appearance. Vespasian, therefore, thought it best to prevent their motions, and to cut off the foundation of their attempts. For although all Samaria had ever garrisons settled among them, yet did the number of those that were come to Mount Gerizim, and their conspiracy together, give ground for fear what they might be at. He therefore sent thither Cerealis, the commander of the 5th legion, with 600 horsemen, and 3,000 footmen, who did not think it safe to go up to the mountain and give them battle, because many of the enemy were on the higher part of the ground. So he encompassed all the lower part of the mountain with his army, and watched them all that day. Now it happened that the Samaritans, who were now destitute of water, were inflamed with a violent heat, for it was summertime, and the multitude had not provided themselves with necessaries, insomuch that some of them died that very day with heat, while others of them preferred slavery to such a death as that was, and fled to the Romans, by whom Cerealis understood that those which still stayed there were very much broken by their misfortunes. So he went up to the mountain, and having placed his forces round about the enemy, he, in the first place, exhorted them to take the security of his right hand, and come to terms with him, and thereby save themselves, and assured them that if they would lay down their arms, he would secure them from any harm. But when he could not prevail with them, he fell upon them, and slew them all, being in number 11,600. This was done on the 27th day of the month of Decius, Sivan. And these were the calamities that befell the Samaritans at this time. But as the people of Jotapata still held out manfully, and bore up under their misfortunes beyond all that could be hoped for, on the 47th day of the siege, the banks cast up by the Romans were become higher than the wall, on which day a certain deserter went to Vespasian, and told him how few were left in the city, and how weak they were, and that they had been so worn out with perpetual watching and as perpetual fighting, that they could not now oppose any force that came against them, and that they might be taken by stratagem, if any one would attack them. For that about the last watch of the night, when they thought they might have some rest from the hardships they were under, and when a morning sleep used to come upon them, as they were thoroughly weary, he said that the watch used to fall asleep. Accordingly, his advice was that they should make their attack at that hour. But Vespasian had a suspicion about this deserter, as knowing how faithful the Jews were to one another, and how much they despised any punishments that could be inflicted on them, this last because one of the people of Jotapata had undergone all sorts of torments, and though they made him pass through a fiery trail of his enemies in his examination, yet would he inform them nothing of the affairs within the city, and as he was crucified, smiled at them. However, the probability there was, and the relation itself did partly confirm the truth of what the deserter told them, and they thought he might probably speak the truth. However, Vespasian thought they should be no great sufferers if the report was a sham, so he commanded them to keep the man in custody, and prepared the army for taking the city. According to which resolution they marched without noise, at the hour that had been told them, to the wall. And it was Titus himself that first got upon it, with one of his tribunes, Domitius Sabinus, and had a few of the 15th legion along with him. So they cut the throats of the watch, and entered the city very quietly. After these came Cerealis the tribune, and Placidus, and led on those that were under them. Now when the citadel was taken, and the enemy were in the very midst of the city, and when it was already day, Yet was not the taking of the city known by those that held it, for a great many of them were fast asleep, and a great mist, which then by chance fell upon the city, hindered those that got up from distinctly seeing the case they were in, till the whole Roman army was gotten in, and they were raised up only to find the miseries they were under, and as they were slaying, they perceived the city was taken. And for the Romans, they so well remembered what they had suffered during the siege, that they spared none, nor pitied any, but drove the people down the precipice from the citadel, and slew them as they drove them down. At which time the difficulties of the place hindered those that were still able to fight from defending themselves. For as they were distressed in the narrow streets, and could not keep their feet sure along the precipice, they were overpowered with the crowd of those that came fighting them down from the citadel. This provoked a great many, even of those chosen men that were about Josephus, to kill themselves with their own hands. For when they saw that they could kill none of the Romans, they resolved to prevent being killed by the Romans, and got together in great numbers in the utmost parts of the city, and killed themselves. However, such of the watch as at the first perceived they were taken, and ran away as fast as they could, went up into one of the towers on the north side of the city, and for a while defended themselves there. But as they were encompassed with a great multitude of enemies, they tried to use their right hands when it was too late, and at length they cheerfully offered their necks to be cut off by those that stood over them. And the Romans might have boasted that the conclusion of the siege was without blood on their side, if there had not been a centurion, Antonius, who was slain at the taking of the city. His death was occasioned by the following treachery. For there was one of those that were fled into the caverns, which were a great number, who desired that this Antonius would reach him his right hand for his security, and would assure him that he would preserve him, and give him his assistance in getting up out of the cavern. Accordingly, he incautiously reached him his right hand, when the other man prevented him, and stabbed him under his loins with a spear, and killed him immediately. And on this day it was that the Romans slew all the multitude that appeared openly. But on the following days they searched the hiding places, and fell upon those that were underground and in the caverns, and went thus through every age, excepting the infants and the women, and of these there were gathered together as captives 1,200. And as for those that were slain at the taking of the city, and in the former fights, they were numbered to be 40,000. So Vespasian gave order that the city should be entirely demolished, and all the fortifications burnt down. And thus was Jotapata taken, in the 13th year of the reign of Nero, on the first day of the month of Panemus, Tammuz. End of Book 3, Chapter 7, Part 2.
Book 3, Chapter 8 of the Wars of the Jews. Book 3, Chapter 8. How Josephus was discovered by a woman, and was willing to deliver himself up to the Romans, and what discourse he had with his own men, when they endeavored to hinder him, and what he said to Vespasian, when he was brought to him, and after what manner Vespasian used him afterward. 1. And now the Romans searched for Josephus, both out of the hatred they bore him, and because their general was very desirous to have him taken, for he reckoned that if he were once taken, the greatest part of the war would be over. They then searched among the dead, and looked into the most concealed recesses of the city. But as the city was first taken, he was assisted by a certain supernatural providence. For he withdrew himself from the enemy when he was in the midst of them, and leaped into a certain deep pit, whereto there adjoined a large den at one side of it, which den could not be seen by those that were above ground. And there he met with 40 persons of eminency that had concealed themselves, and with provisions enough to satisfy them for not a few days. So in the daytime he hid himself from the enemy, who had seized upon all places, and in the nighttime he got up out of the den and looked about for some way of escaping, and took exact notice of the watch. But as all places were guarded everywhere on his account, that there was no way of getting off unseen, he went down again into the den. Thus he concealed himself 2 days, but on the 3rd day, when they had taken a woman who had been with them, he was discovered. Whereupon Vespasian sent immediately and zealously 2 tribunes, Paulinus and Gallicanus, and ordered them to give Josephus their right hands as a security for his life, and to exhort him to come up. 2. So they came and invited the man to come up, and gave him assurances that his life should be preserved. But they did not prevail with him, for he gathered suspicions from the probability there was that one who had done so many things against the Romans must suffer for it, though not from the mild temper of those that invited him. However, he was afraid that he was invited to come up in order to be punished, until Vespasian sent besides these a third tribune, Nicanor, to him. He was one that was well known to Josephus, and had been his familiar acquaintance in old time. When he was come, he enlarged upon the natural mildness of the Romans towards those they have once conquered, and told him that he had behaved himself so valiantly that the commanders rather admired than hated him, that the general was very desirous to have him brought to him, not in order to punish him, for that he could do though he should not come voluntarily, but that he was determined to preserve a man of his courage. He moreover added this, that Vespasian, had he been resolved to impose upon him, would not have sent to him a friend of his own, nor put the fairest color upon the vilest action, by pretending friendship and meaning perfidiousness, nor would he have himself acquiesced, or come to him, had it been to deceive him. 3. Now as Josephus began to hesitate with himself about Nicanor's proposal, the soldiery were so angry that they ran hastily to set fire to the den, but the tribune would not permit them to do so, as being very desirous to take the man alive. And now, as Nicanor lay hard at Josephus to comply, and he understood how the multitude of the enemies threatened him, he called to mind the dreams which he had dreamed in the night time, whereby God had signified to him beforehand both the future calamities of the Jews, and the events that concern the Roman emperors. Now Josephus was able to give shrewd conjectures about the interpretation of such dreams as have been ambiguously delivered by God. Moreover, he was not unacquainted with the prophecies contained in the sacred books, as being a priest himself, and of the posterity of priests. And just then he was in an ecstasy, and setting before him the tremendous images of the dreams he had lately had, he put up a secret prayer to God, and said, Since it pleaseth thee, who hast created the Jewish nation, to depress the same, and since all their good fortune is gone over to the Romans, and since thou hast made choice of this soul of mine, to foretell what is to come pass hereafter, I willingly give them my hands, and am content to live. And I protest openly that I do not go over to the Romans as a deserter of the Jews, but as a minister from thee. 4. When he had said this, he complied with Nicanor's invitation. But when those Jews who had fled with him understood that he yielded to those that invited him to come up, they came about him in a body and cried out, Nay, indeed, now may the laws of our forefathers, which God ordained himself, well grown to purpose, that God we mean who hath created the souls of the Jews of such a temper that they despise death. O Josephus, art thou still fond of life, and canst thou bear to see the light in a state of slavery? How soon hast thou forgotten thyself? How many hast thou persuaded to lose their lives for liberty? Thou hast therefore had a false reputation for manhood, and a like false reputation for wisdom, if thou canst hope for preservation from those against whom thou hast fought so zealously, and art however willing to be preserved by them, if they be in earnest. But although the good fortune of the Romans hath made thee forget thyself, we ought to take care that the glory of our forefathers may not be tarnished. We will lend thee our right hand and sword, and if thou wilt die willingly, thou wilt die as general of the Jews, but if unwillingly, thou wilt die as a traitor to them. As soon as they said this, they began to thrust their swords at him, and threatened they would kill him, if he thought of yielding himself to the Romans. 5. Upon this Josephus was afraid of their attacking him, and yet thought he should be a betrayer of the commands of God, if he died before they were delivered. So he began to talk like a philosopher to them in the distress he was in then, when he said thus to them, O my friends, why are we so earnest to kill ourselves, and why do we set our soul and body, which are such dear companions, at such variance? Can anyone pretend that I am not the man I was formerly? Nay, the Romans are sensible how that matter stands well enough. It is a brave thing to die in war, but so that it be according to the law of war by the hand of conquerors. If therefore I avoid death from the sword of the Romans, I am truly worthy to be killed by my own sword and my own hand. But if they admit of mercy and would spare their enemy, how much more ought we to have mercy upon ourselves, and to spare ourselves? For it is certainly a foolish thing to do that to ourselves which we quarrel with them for doing to us. I confess freely that it is a brave thing to die for liberty, but still so that it be in war, and done by those who take that liberty from us. But in the present case, our enemies do neither meet us in battle, nor do they kill us. Now he is equally a coward who will not die when he is obliged to die, and he who will die when he is not obliged so to do. What are we afraid of, when we will not go up to the Romans? Is it death? If so, what are we afraid of? When we but suspect our enemies will inflict it on us, shall we inflict it on ourselves for certain? But it may be said we must be slaves. And are we then in a clear state of liberty at present? It may also be said that it is a manly act for one to kill himself. No, certainly, but a most unmanly one, as I should esteem that pilot to be an arrant coward, who, out of fear of a storm, should sink his ship of his own accord. Now self-murder is a crime most remote from the common nature of all animals, and an instance of impiety against God our Creator. Nor indeed is there any animal that dies of its own contrivance, or by its own means, for the desire of life is a law engraven in them all. On what account we deem those that openly take it away from us to be our enemies, and those that do it by treachery are punished for so doing. And do not you think that God is very angry when a man does injury to what he hath bestowed on him? For from him it is that we have received our being, and we ought to leave it to his disposal to take that being away from us. The bodies of all men are indeed mortal, and are created out of corruptible matter. But the soul is ever immortal, and is a portion of the divinity that inhabits our bodies. Besides, if anyone destroys or abuses a depositum he hath received from a mere man, he is esteemed a wicked and perfidious person. But then if anyone cast out of his body this divine depositum, can we imagine that he who is thereby affronted does not know of it? Moreover, our law justly ordains that slaves which run away from their master shall be punished, though the masters they run away from may have been wicked masters to them. And shall we endeavor to run away from God, who is the best of all masters, and not guilty of impiety? Do not you know that those who depart out of this life according to the law of nature, and pay that debt which was received from God, which he that lent it us, is pleased to require it back again, enjoy eternal fame, that their houses and their posterity are sure, that their souls are pure and obedient, and obtain a most holy place in heaven, for whence, in the revolutions of ages, they are again sent into pure bodies, while the souls of those whose hands have acted madly against themselves are received by the darkest place in Hades, and while God, who is their Father, punishes those that offend against either of them in their posterity? For which reason God hates such doings, and the crime is punished by our most wise legislator. Accordingly, our laws determine that the bodies of such as kill themselves should be exposed till the sun be set, without burial, although at the same time it be allowed by them to be lawful to bury our enemies sooner. The laws of other nations also enjoin such men's hands to be cut off when they are dead, which have been made use of in destroying themselves when alive, while they reckon that as a body is alien from the soul, so is the hand alien from the body. It is therefore, my friends, a right thing to reason justly, and not add to the calamities which men bring upon us impiety towards our Creator. If we have a mind to preserve ourselves, let us do it. For to be preserved by those our enemies, to whom we have given so many demonstrations of our courage, is no way inglorious. But if we have a mind to die, it is good to die by the hand of those that have conquered us. For nay part, I will not run over to our enemies' quarters, in order to be a traitor to myself, for certainly I should then be much more foolish than those that deserted to the enemy, since they did it in order to save themselves, and I should do it for destruction, for my own destruction. However, I heartily wish the Romans may prove treacherous in this matter, for if, after their offer of their right hand for security, I be slain by them, I shall die cheerfully, and carry away with me the sense of their perfidiousness, as a consolation greater than victory itself. 6. Now these and many the like motives did Josephus use to these men to prevent their murdering themselves. But desperation had shut their ears, as having long ago devoted themselves to die, and they were irritated at Josephus. They then ran upon him with their swords in their hands, one from one quarter, and another from another, and called him a coward, and every one of them appeared openly as if he were ready to smite him. But he, calling to one of them by name, and looking like a general to another, and taking a third by the hand, and making a fourth ashamed of himself, by praying him to forbear, and being in this condition distracted with various passions, as he well might in the great distress he was then in, he kept off every one of their swords from killing him, and was forced to do like such wild beasts as are encompassed about on every side, who always turn themselves against those that last touch them. Nay, some of their right hands were debilitated by the reverence they bear to their generals in these his fatal calamities, and their swords dropped out of their hands, and not a few of them there were, who, when they aimed to smite him with their swords, they were not thoroughly either willing or able to do it. 7. However, in this extreme distress, he was not destitute of his usual sagacity, but trusting himself to the providence of God, he put his life into hazard in the following manner. And now, he said, since it is resolved among you that you will die, come on, let us commit our mutual deaths to determination by lot. He whom the lot falls to first, let him be killed by him that hath the second lot, and thus fortune shall make it progress through us all, nor shall any of us perish by his own right hand. For it would be unfair if, when the rest are gone, somebody should repent and save himself. This proposal appeared to them to be very just, and when he had prevailed with them to determine this matter by lots, he drew one of the lots for himself also. He who had the first lot laid his neck bare to him that had the next, as supposing that the general would die among them immediately, for they thought death, if Josephus might but die with them, was sweeter than life. Yet he was with another left to the last, whether we must say it happened so by chance, or whether by the providence of God. And as he was very desirous neither to be condemned by the lot, nor, if he had been left to the last, to imbrue his right hand in the blood of his countrymen, he persuaded him to trust his fidelity to him, and to live as well as himself. 8. Thus Josephus escaped in the war with the Romans, and in this his own war with his friends, and was led by Nicanor to Vespasian. But now all the Romans ran together to see him, and as the multitude pressed one upon another about their general, there was a tumult of various kind, while some rejoiced that Josephus was taken, and some threatened him, and some crowded to see him very near. But those that were more remote cried out to have this their enemy put to death, while those that were near called to mind the actions he had done, and a deep concern appeared at the change of his fortune. Nor were there any of the Roman commanders, how much soever they had been enraged at him before, but relented when they came to the sight of him. Above all the rest, Titus's own valor, and Josephus's own patience under his afflictions, made him pity him, as did also the commiseration of his age, when he recalled to mind that but a little while ago he was fighting, but lay now in the hands of his enemies, which made him consider the power of fortune, and how quick is the turn of affairs in war, and how no state of men is sure. For which reason he then made a great many more to be of the same pitiful temper with himself, and induced them to commiserate Josephus. He was also of great weight in persuading his father to preserve him. However, Vespasian gave strict orders that he should be kept with great caution, as though he would in a very little time send him to Nero. 9. When Josephus heard him give these orders, he said that he had somewhat in his mind that he would willingly say to himself alone. When therefore they were all ordered to withdraw, except Titus and 2 of his friends, he said, Thou, O Vespasian, thinkest no more than that thou hast taken Josephus himself captive, but I come to thee as a messenger of great tidings. For had not I been sent by God to thee, I knew what was the law of the Jews in this case, and how it becomes generals to die. Dost thou send me to Nero? For why? Are Nero's successors till they come to thee still alive? Thou, O Vespasian, art Caesar and emperor, thou and this thy son. Bind me not still faster, and keep me for thyself, for thou, O Caesar, are not only Lord over me, but over the land and the sea and all mankind. And certainly I deserve to be kept in closer custody than I am now in order to be punished, if I rashly affirm anything of God." When he had said this, Vespasian at present did not believe him, but supposed that Josephus said this as a cunning trick, in order to his own preservation. But in a little time he was convinced, and believed what he said to be true, God himself erecting his expectations, so as to think of obtaining the empire, and by other signs foreshowing his advancement. He also found Josephus to have spoken truth on other occasions, for one of those friends that were present at that secret conference said to Josephus, "I cannot but wonder how thou couldst not foretell to the people of Jotapata that they should be taken, nor couldst foretell this captivity which hath happened to thyself, unless what thou now sayest be a vain thing, in order to avoid the rage that is risen against thyself." To which Josephus replied, "I did foretell to the people of Jotapata that they would be taken on the 47th day, and that I should be caught alive by the Romans." Now when Vespasian had inquired of the captives privately about these predictions, he found them to be true, and then he began to believe those that concerned himself. Yet did he not set Josephus at liberty from his hands, but bestowed on him suits of clothes and other precious gifts. He treated him also in a very obliging manner, and continued so to do, Titus still joining his interest till the honors that were done him. Book 3, Chapter 9 of the Wars of the Jews. Book 3, Chapter 9. How Joppa was taken, and Tiberius delivered up. 1. Now Vespasian returned to Ptolemais on the 4th day of the month Tammuz, and from thence he came to Caesarea, which lay by the seaside. This was a very great city of Judea, and for the greatest part inhabited by Greeks. The citizens here received both the Roman army and its generals, with all sorts of acclamations and rejoicings, and this partly out of the good will they bore to the Romans, but principally out of the hatred they bore to those that were conquered by them, on which account they came clamoring against Josephus in crowds, and desired he might be put to death. But Vespasian passed over this petition concerning him, as offered by the injudicious multitude, with a bare silence. 2 of the legions he also placed at Caesarea, that they might there take their winter quarters, as perceiving the city very fit for such a purpose. But he placed the 10th and the 5th at Scythopolis, that he might not distress Caesarea with the entire army. This place was warm even in winter, as it was suffocating hot in the summertime, by reason of its situation in a plain, and near the Sea of Galilee. 2. In the meantime, there were gathered together as well such as the seditiously had got out from among their enemies, as those that had escaped out of the demolished cities, which were in all a great number, and repaired Joppa, which had been left desolate by Cestius, that it might serve them for a place of refuge, and because the adjoining region had been laid waste in the war, and was not capable of supporting them, they determined to go off to sea. They also built themselves a great many piratical ships, and turned pirates upon the seas near to Syria, and Phoenicia, and Egypt, and made those seas unnavigable to men. Now as soon as Vespasian knew of their conspiracy, he sent both footmen and horsemen to Joppa, which was unguarded in the night time. However, those that were in it perceived that they should be attacked, and were afraid of it. Yet did they not endeavor to keep the Romans out, but fled to their ships, and lay at sea all night, out of the reach of their darts. 3. Now Joppa is not naturally a haven, for it ends in a rough shore, where all the rest of it is straight, but the 2 ends bend towards each other, where there are deep precipices, and great stones that jut out into the sea, and where the chains wherewith Andromeda was bound have left their footsteps, which attest to the antiquity of that fable. But the north wind oppresses and beats upon the shore, and dashes mighty waves against the rocks which receive them, and renders the haven more dangerous than the country they had deserted. Now as those people of Joppa were floating about in this sea, in the morning there fell a violent wind upon them. It is called by those that sail there the black north wind, and there dashed their ships one against another, and dashed some of them against the rocks, and carried many of them by force, while they strove against the opposite waves, into the main sea. For the shore was so rocky, and had so many of the enemy upon it, that they were afraid to come to land. Nay, the waves rose so very high that they drowned them, nor was there any place whither they could fly, nor any way to save themselves, while they were thrust out of the sea by the violence of the wind, if they stayed where they were, and out of the city by the violence of the Romans. And much lamentation there was when the ships were dashed against one another, and a terrible noise when they were broken to pieces. And some of the multitude that were in them were covered with waves, and so perished. And a great many were embarrassed with shipwrecks. But some of them thought that to die by their own swords was lighter than by the sea, and so they killed themselves before they were drowned, although the greatest part of them were carried by the waves, and dashed to pieces against the abrupt parts of the rocks, insomuch that the sea was bloody a long way, and the maritime parts were full of dead bodies. For the Romans came upon those that were carried to the shore, and destroyed them, and the number of the bodies that were thus thrown out of the sea was 4,200. The Romans also took the city without opposition, and utterly demolished it. 4. And thus Joppa taken twice by the Romans in a little time, but Vespasian, in order to prevent these pirates from coming thither any more, erected a camp there, where the citadel of Joppa had been, and left a body of horse in it, with a few footmen, that these last might stay there and guard the camp, and the horsemen might spoil the country that lay round it, and might destroy the neighboring villages and smaller cities. So these troops overran the country, as they were ordered to do, and every day cut to pieces and laid desolate the whole region. 5. But now, when the fate of Jotapata was related at Jerusalem, a great many at the first disbelieved it, on account of the vastness of the calamity, and because they had no eyewitness to attest the truth of what was related about it. For not one person was saved to be a messenger of that news, but a fame was spread abroad at random that the city was taken, as such fame usually spreads bad news about. However, the truth was known by degrees, from places near Jotapata, and appeared to all to be too true. Yet there were fictitious stories added to what was really done, for it was reported that Josephus was slain at the taking of the city, which piece of news filled Jerusalem full of sorrow. In every house also, and among all to whom any of the slain were allied, there was a lamentation for them, but the mourning for the commander was a public one, and some mourned for those that had lived with them, others for their kindred, others for their friends, and others for their brethren, but all mourned for Josephus, insomuch that the lamentation did not cease in the city before the 30th day, and a great many hired mourners, with their pipes, who should begin the melancholy ditties for them. Footnote: These public mourners, hired upon the supposed death of Josephus, and the real death of many more, illustrate some passages in the Bible, which suppose the same custom, as Matthew 11 verse 17, where the reader may consult the notes of Grotius. End footnote. 6. But as the truth came out in time, it appeared how the affairs of Jotapata really stood. Yet as it was found that the death of Josephus was a fiction, and when they understood that he was alive and was among the Romans, and that the commanders treated him at another rate than they treated captives, they were as vehemently angry at him now as they had showed their goodwill before, when he appeared to have been dead. He was also abused by some as having been a coward, and by others as a deserter, and the city was full of indignation at him, and of reproaches cast upon him. Their rage was also aggravated by their afflictions, and more inflamed by their ill success, and what usually becomes of an occasion of caution to wise men, I mean affliction, became a spur to them to venture on further calamities, and the end of one misery became still the beginning of another. They therefore resolved to fall on the Romans the more vehemently, as resolving to be revenged on him in revenging themselves on the Romans. And this was the state of Jerusalem as to the troubles which now came upon it. 7. But Vespasian, in order to see the kingdom of Agrippa, while the king persuaded him so to do, partly in order to his treating the general and his army in the best and most splendid manner his private affairs would enable him to do, and partly that he might, by their means, correct such things as were amiss in his government, he removed from Caesarea, which was by the seaside, and went to that which is called Caesarea Philippi. Footnote: Of this Caesarea Philippi, twice mentioned in our New Testament, Matthew 16 verse 13, Mark 8 verse 27, there are coins still extant. Spanheim here informs us. End footnote. And there he refreshed his army for 20 days, and was himself feasted by King Agrippa, where he also returned public thanks to God for the good success he had had in his undertakings. But as soon as he was informed that Tiberius was fond of innovations, and that Tarcheri had revolted, Both these cities were a part of the kingdom of Agrippa, and was satisfied within himself that the Jews were everywhere perverted from their obedience to their governors. He thought it seasonable to make an expedition against these cities, and that for the sake of Agrippa, and in order to bring his cities to reason. So he sent away his son Titus to the other Caesarea, that he might bring the army that lay there to Sethappaus, which is the largest city of Decapolis, and in the neighborhood of Tiberias, whither he came, and where he waited for his son. He then came with 3 legions, and pitched his camp 30 furlongs off Tiberias, at a certain station easily seen by the innovators. It is named Cenabris. He also sent Valerian, a decurion, with 50 horsemen, to speak peaceably to those that were in the city, and to exhort them to give him assurances of their fidelity, for he had heard that the people were desirous of peace, but were obliged by some of the seditious part to join with them, and so were forced to fight for them. When Valerian had marched up to the place, and was near the wall, he alighted off his horse, and made those that were with him to do the same, that they might not be thought to come to skirmish with them. But before they could come to a discourse one with another, the most potent men among the seditious made a sally upon them armed. Their leader was one whose name was Jesus, the son of Shaphat, the principal head of a band of robbers. Now Valerian, neither thinking it safe to fight contrary to the commands of the general, though he were secure of a victory, and knowing that it was very hazardous undertaking for a few to fight with many, for those that were unprovided to fight those that were ready, and being on other accounts surprised at this unexpected onset of the Jews, he ran away on foot, as did 5 of the rest in like manner, and left their horses behind them, which horses Jesus led away into the city, and rejoiced as if they had taken them in battle, and not by treachery. 8. Now the seniors of the people, and such as were of principal authority among them, fearing what would be the issue of this matter, fled to the camp of the Romans. They then took their king along with them, and fell down before Vespasian, to supplicate his favor, and besought him not to overlook them, nor to impute the madness of a few to the whole city, to spare a people that had been ever civil and obliging to the Romans, but to bring the authors of this revolt to due punishment, who had hitherto so watched them, that though they were zealous to give them the security of their right hands of a long time, yet could they not accomplish the same. With these supplications the general complied, although he were very angry at the whole city about the carrying off his horses, and this because he saw that Agrippa was under a great concern for them. So when Vespasian and Agrippa had accepted their right hands by way of security, Jesus and his party thought it not safe for them to continue at Tiberias, so they ran away to Tarichete. The next day Vespasian sent Trajan before with some horsemen to the citadel, to make trial of the multitude, whether they were disposed for peace. And as soon as he knew that the people were of the same mind with the petitioner, he took his army and went to the city, upon which the citizens opened to him their gates, and met him with acclamations of joy, and called him their Savior and benefactor. But as the army was a great while in getting in at the gates, they were so narrow, Vespasian commanded the south wall to be broken down, and so made a broad passage for their entrance. However, he charged them to abstain from rapine and injustice, in order to gratify the king, and on his account spared the rest of the wall, while the king undertook for them that they should continue faithful to the Romans for the time to come. And thus did he restore the city to a quiet state, after it had been grievously afflicted by the sedition. Book 3, Chapter 10 of the Wars of the Jews. Book 3, Chapter 10. How Tariche was taken, a description of the river Jordan, and of the country of Gennesareth. 1. And now Vespasian pitched his camp between this city and Tariche, but fortified his camp more strongly, as suspecting that he should be forced to stay there, and have a long war. For all the innovators had gotten together at Tariche, as relying upon the strength of the city, and on the lake that lay by it. This lake is called by the people of the country the Lake of Gennesareth. The city itself is situated like Tiberias, at the bottom of a mountain, and on those sides which are not washed by the sea, have been strongly fortified by Josephus, though not so strongly as Tiberias. For the wall of Tiberias had been built at the beginning of the Jews' revolt, when he had great plenty of money, and great power. But the Tarichees partook only the remains of that liberality. Yet had they a great number of ships gotten ready upon the lake, that, in case they were beaten at land, they might retire to them. and they were so fitted up that they might undertake a sea fight also. But as the Romans were building a wall about their camp, Jesus and his party were neither affrighted at their number, nor at the good order they were in, but made a sally upon them. And at the very first onset the builders of the wall were dispersed, and these pulled what little they had before built to pieces. But as soon as they saw the armed men getting together, and before they had suffered anything themselves, they retired to their own men. But then the Romans pursued them, and drove them into their ships, where they launched out as far as might give them the opportunity of reaching the Romans with what they threw at them, and then cast anchor, and brought their ships close, as in a line of battle, and thence fought the enemy from the sea, who were themselves at land. But Vespasian, hearing that a great multitude of them were gotten together in the plain that was before the city, he thereupon sent his son, with 600 chosen horsemen, to disperse them. 2. But when Titus perceived that the enemy was very numerous, he sent to his father, and informed him that he should want more forces. But as he saw a great many of the horsemen eager to fight, and that before any succors could come to them, and that yet some of them were privately under a sort of consternation at the multitude of the Jews, he stood in a place whence he might be heard, and said to them, My brave Romans, for it is right for me to put you in mind of what nation you are, in the beginning of my speech, that so you may not be ignorant who you are, and who they are against whom we are going to fight. For as to us, Romans, no part of the habitable earth hath been able to escape our hands hitherto. But as for the Jews, that I may speak of them too, though they have been already beaten, yet do they not give up the cause. And a sad thing it would be for us to grow wealthy under good success, when they bear up under their misfortunes. As to the alacrity which you show publicly, I see it, and rejoice at it. Yet am I afraid lest the multitude of the enemy should bring a concealed fright upon some of you. Let such a one consider again who we are that are to fight, and who those are against whom we are to fight. Now these Jews, though they be very bold and great despisers of death, are but a disorderly body, and unskillful in war, and may rather be called a rout than an army, while I need say nothing of our skill and our good order. For this is the reason why we Romans alone are exercised for war in time of peace, that we may not think of number when we come to fight with our enemies. For what advantage should we reap by our continual sort of war, if we must still be equal in number to such as have not been used to war? Consider further, that you are to have a conflict with men in effect unarmed, while you are well armed, with footmen, while you are horsemen, with those that have no good general, while you have one. And as these advantages make you in effect manifold more than you are, so do their disadvantages mightily diminish their number. Now it is not the multitude of men, though they be soldiers, that manages wars with success, but it is their bravery that does it, though they be but few. For a few are easily set in battle array, and can easily assist one another, while over-numerous armies are more hurt by themselves than by their enemies. It is boldness and rashness, the effects of madness, that conduct the Jews. Those passions indeed make a great figure when they succeed, but are quite extinguished upon the least ill success. But we are led on by courage and obedience and fortitude, which shows itself indeed in our good fortune, but still does not forever desert us in our ill fortune. Nay, indeed, your fighting is to be on greater motives than those of the Jews. For although they run the hazard of war for liberty and for their country, yet what can be a greater motive to us than glory? And that it may never be said, that after we have got dominion of the habitable earth, the Jews are able to confront us. We must also reflect upon this, that there is no fear of our suffering any incurable disaster in the present case, for those that are ready to assist us are many, and at hand also. Yet it is in our power to seize upon this victory ourselves, and I think we ought to prevent the coming of those my Father is sending to us for our assistance, that our success may be peculiar to ourselves, and of greater reputation to us. And I cannot but think this an opportunity wherein my Father, and I, and you shall be all put to the trial, whether he be worthy of his former glorious performances, whether I be his son in reality, and whether you be really my soldiers. For it is usual for my Father to conquer, and for myself, I should not bear the thoughts of returning to him if I were once taken by the enemy. And how will you be able to avoid being ashamed if you do not show equal courage with your commander when he goes before you into danger? For you know very well that I shall go into the danger first, and make the first attack upon the enemy. Do not you therefore desert me, but persuade yourselves that God will be assisting to my onset. Know this also before we begin, that we shall now have better success than we should have if we were to fight at a distance." 3. As Titus was saying this, an extraordinary fury fell upon the men, and as Trajan was already come before the fight began, with 400 horsemen, they were uneasy at it, because the reputation of the victory would be diminished by being common to so many. Vespasian had also sent both Antonius and Silo, with 2,000 archers, and had given it them in charge to seize upon the mountain that was over against the city, and repel those that were upon the wall, which archers did as they were commanded, and prevented those that attempted to assist them that way. And now Titus made his own horse march first against the enemy, as did the others with a great noise after him, and extended themselves upon the plain as wide as the enemy which confronted them, by which means they appeared much more numerous than they really were. Now the Jews, although they were surprised at this onset, and at their good order, made resistance against their attacks for a little while. But when they were pricked with very long poles, and overborne by the violent noise of the horsemen, they came to be trampled under their feet. Many also of them were slain on every side, which made them disperse themselves, and run to the city, as fast as every one of them were able. So Titus pressed upon the hindmost, and slew them. And of the rest, some he fell upon as they stood on heaps, and some he prevented, and met them in the mouth, and run them through. Many also he leaped upon as they fell one upon another, and trod them down, and cut off all the retreat they had to the wall, and turned them back into the plain, till at last they forced a passage by their multitude, and got away, and ran into the city. 4. But now there fell out a terrible sedition among them within the city, for the inhabitants themselves, who had possessions there, and to whom the city belonged, were not disposed to fight from the very beginning, and now the less so because they had been beaten. But the foreigners, which were very numerous, would force them to fight so much the more, insomuch that there was a clamor and a tumult among them, as all mutually angry one at another. And when Titus heard this tumult, for he was not far from the wall, he cried out, "Fellow soldiers, now is the time, and why do we make any delay, when God is giving up the Jews to us? Take the victory which is given you. Do not you hear what a noise they make? Those that escaped our hands are ill and uproar against one another. We have the city if we make haste, but besides haste we must undergo some labor, and use some courage, for no great thing uses to be accomplished without danger. Accordingly, we must not only prevent their uniting again, which necessity will soon compel them to do, but we must also prevent the coming of our men to our assistance, that, as few as we are, we may conquer so great a multitude, and may ourselves alone take the city." 5. As soon as ever Titus had said this, he leaped upon his horse, and rode apace down to the lake, by which lake he marched, and entered into the city the first of them all, as did the others soon after him. Hereupon those that were upon the walls were seized with a terror at the boldness of the attempt, nor durst any one venture to fight with him, or to hinder him. So they left guarding the city, and some of those that were about Jesus fled over the country, while others of them ran down to the lake, and met the enemy in the teeth, and some were slain as they were getting up into the ships, but others of them as they attempted to overtake those that were already gone aboard. There was also a great slaughter made in the city, while those foreigners that had not fled away already made opposition, but the natural inhabitants were killed without fighting, for in hopes of Titus's giving them his right hand for their security, and out of a consciousness that they had not given any consent to the war, they avoided fighting, till Titus had slain the authors of this revolt, and then put a stop to any further slaughters, out of a commiseration of these inhabitants of the place. But for those that had fled to the lake, upon seeing the city taken, they sailed as far as they possibly could from the enemy. 6. Hereupon Titus sent one of his horsemen to his father, and let him know the good news of what he had done, at which, as was natural, he was very joyful, both on account of the courage and glorious actions of his son, for he thought that now the greatest part of the war was over. He then came thither himself, and set men to guard the city, and gave them command to take care that nobody got privately out of it, but to kill such as attempted so to do. And on the next day he went down to the lake, and commanded that vessels should be fitted up, in order to pursue those that had escaped in ships. These vessels were quickly gotten ready accordingly, because there was great plenty of materials, and a great number of artificers also. 7. Now this lake of Gennesareth is so called from the country adjoining to it. Its breadth is 40 furlongs, and its length 140. Its waters are sweet, and very agreeable for drinking, for they are finer than the thick waters of other fens. The lake is also pure, and on every side ends directly at the shores, and at the sand. It is also of a temperate nature when you draw it up, and of a more gentle nature than river or fountain water, and yet always cooler than one could expect in so diffuse a place as this is. Now when this water is kept in the open air, it is as cold as that snow which the country people are accustomed to make by night in summer. There are several kinds of fish in it, different both in the taste and the sight from those elsewhere. It is divided into 2 parts by the river Jordan. Now Paneum is thought to be the fountain of Jordan, but in reality it is carried thither after an occult manner from the place called Fiala. This place lies as you go up to Trachonitis, and is 120 furlongs from Caesarea, and is not far out of the road on the right hand, and indeed it hath its name Fiala, vial or bowl, very justly, from the roundness of its circumference, as being round like a wheel. Its water continues always up to its edges, without either sinking or running over. And as this origin of Jordan was formerly not known, it was discovered so to be when Philip was tetrarch of Trachonitis, for he had chaff thrown into Fiala, and it was found at Paneto, where the ancients thought the fountain head of the river was, whither it had been therefore carried by the waters. As for Paneum itself, its natural beauty had been improved by the royal liberality of Agrippa, and adorned at his expenses. Now Jordan's visible stream arises from this cavern, and divides the marshes and fens of the lake Semiconitis. When it hath run another 120 furlongs, it first passes by the city Julius, and then passes through the middle of the lake Gennesareth, after which it runs a long way over a desert, and then makes its exit into the lake Asphaltitis. 8. The country also that lies over against this lake hath the same name of Gennesareth. Its nature is wonderful as well as its beauty. Its soil is so fruitful that all sorts of trees can grow upon it, and the inhabitants accordingly plant all sorts of trees there. For the temper of the air is so well mixed, that it agrees very well with those several sorts, particularly walnuts, which require the coldest air, flourish there in vast plenty. There are palm trees also, which grow best in hot air. Fig trees also and olives grow near them, which yet require an air that is more temperate. One may call this place the ambition of nature, where it forces those plants that are naturally enemies to one another to agree together. It is a happy contention of the seasons, as if every one of them laid claim to this country. For it not only nourishes different sorts of autumnal fruit beyond men's expectation, but preserves them a great while. It supplies men with principal fruits, with grapes and figs continually, during 10 months of the year, and the rest of the fruits as they become ripe together throughout the whole year. Footnote: It may be worth our while to observe here, that near this lake Gennesareth, grapes and figs hang on the trees 10 months of the year. We may observe also, that in Cyril of Jerusalem, which was delivered not long before Easter, there was no fresh leaves of fig trees, nor bunches of fresh grapes in Judea. So that when St. Mark says, chapter 11, verse 13, that our Savior, soon after the same time of the year, came and found leaves on a fig tree near Jerusalem, but no figs, because the time of new figs ripening was not yet, he says very true, nor were they therefore other than old leaves which our Savior saw, and old figs which he expected, and even with us commonly hang on trees all winter long. End footnote. For besides the good temperature of the air, it is also water from a most fertile fountain. The people of the country call it Capernaum. Some have thought it to be a vein of the Nile, because it produces the Curacan fish as well as that lake does which is near to Alexandria. The length of this country extends itself along the banks of this lake that bears the same name for 30 furlongs, and is in breadth 20. And this is the nature of that place. 9. But now, when the vessels were gotten ready, Vespasian put upon shipboard as many of his forces as he thought sufficient to be too hard for those that were upon the lake, and set sail after them. Now these which were driven into the lake could neither fly to the land, where all was in their enemy's hand, and in war against them, nor could they fight upon the level by sea, for their ships were small and fitted only for piracy. They were too weak to fight with Vespasian's vessels, and the mariners that were in them were so few, that they were afraid to come near the Romans, who attacked them in great numbers. However, as they sailed round about the vessels, and sometimes as they came near them, they threw stones at the Romans when they were a good way off, or came closer and fought them. Yet did they receive the greatest harm themselves in both cases. As for the stones they threw at the Romans, they only made a sound one after another, for they threw them against such as were in their armor, while the Roman darts could reach the Jews themselves. And when they ventured to come near the Romans, they became sufferers themselves before they could do any harm to the either, and were drowned, they and their ships together. As for those that endeavored to come to an actual fight, the Romans ran many of them through with their long poles. Sometimes the Romans leaped into their ships with swords in their hands and slew them. But when some of them met the vessels, the Romans caught them by the middle and destroyed at once their ships and themselves who were taken in them. As for such as were drowning in the sea, if they lifted their heads up above the water, they were either killed by darts or caught by the vessels. But if, in the desperate case they were in, they attempted to swim to their enemies, the Romans cut off either their heads or their hands, and indeed they were destroyed after various manners everywhere, till the rest, being put to flight, were forced to get upon the land, while the vessels encompassed them about on the sea. But as many of these were repulsed when they were getting ashore, they were killed by the darts upon the lake, and the Romans leaped out of their vessels, and destroyed a great many more upon the land. One might then see the lake all bloody and full of dead bodies, for not one of them escaped. And a terrible stink, and a very sad sight there was on the following days over that country. For as for the shores, they were full of shipwrecks and of dead bodies all swelled. And as the dead bodies were inflamed by the sun, and putrefied, they corrupted the air, insomuch that the misery was not only the object of commiseration to the Jews, but to those that hated them, and had been the authors of that misery. This was the upshot of the sea fight. The number of the slain, including those that were killed in the city before, was 6,500. 10. After this fight was over, Vespasian sat upon his tribunal at Taricheae, in order to distinguish the foreigners from the old inhabitants, for those foreigners appeared to have begun the war. So he deliberated with the other commanders, whether he ought to save those old inhabitants or not. And when those commanders alleged that the dismission of them that would be to his own disadvantage, because, when they were once set at liberty, they would not be at rest, since they would be people destitute of proper habitations, and would be able to compel such as they fled to fight against us, Vespasian acknowledged that they did not deserve to be saved, and that if they had leave given them to fly away, they would make use of it against those that gave them that leave. But still he considered with himself after what manner they should be slain, for if he had them slain there, he suspected the people of the country would thereby become his enemies. Footnote: This is the most cruel and barbarous action that Vespasian ever did in this whole war, as he did it with great reluctance also. It was done both after public assurance given of sparing the prisoners' lives, and when all knew and confessed that these prisoners were in no way guilty of any sedition against the Romans. Nor indeed did Titus now give his consent, so far as appears, nor ever act of himself so barbarously. Nay, soon after this, Titus grew quite weary of shedding blood, and of punishing the innocent with the guilty, and gave the people of Gessala leave to keep the Jewish Sabbath, in the midst of their siege. Nor was Vespasian disposed to do what he did, till his officers persuaded him, and that from two principal topics, viz., that nothing could be unjust that was done against Jews, and that when both cannot be consistent, advantage must prevail over justice. Admirable court doctrines these. End footnote. For that to be sure they would never bear it, that so many that had been supplicants to him should be killed, and to offer violence to them, after he had given them assurances of their lives, he could not himself bear to do it. However, his friends were too hard for him, and pretended that nothing against Jews could be any impiety, and that he ought to prefer what was profitable before what was fit to be done, where both could not be made consistent. So he gave them an ambiguous liberty to do as they advised, and permitted the prisoners to go along no other road than that which led to Tiberias only. So they readily believed what they desired to be true, and went along securely, with their effects, the way which was allowed them, while the Romans seized upon all the road that led to Tiberias, that none of them might go out of it, and shut them up in the city. Then came Vespasian, and ordered them all to stand in the stadium, and commanded them to kill the old men, together with the others that were useless, which were in number 1,200. Out of the young men he chose 6,000 of the strongest, and sent them to Nero, to dig through the isthmus, and sold the remainder for slaves, being 30,400, besides such as he made a present of to Agrippa. For as to those that belonged to his kingdom, he gave him leave to do what he pleased with them. However, the king sold these also for slaves, but for the rest of the multitude, who were Trachonites, and Galenites, and of Hippos, and some of Gadara, and the greatest part of them were seditious persons and fugitives, who were of such shameful characters, that they preferred war before peace. These prisoners were taken on the 8th day of the month Gorpieus, Elu.
Book 4, Chapter 1 of the Wars of the Jews. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Chapter 1. The Siege and Taking of Gamala. 1. Now all those Galileans who, after the taking of Jotapata, had revolted from the Romans, did, upon the conquest of Tarichae, deliver themselves up to them again. And the Romans received all the fortresses and the cities, excepting Giscala, and those that had seized upon Mount Tabor. Gamala also, which is a city ever against Tarachem, but on the other side of the lake, conspired with them. This city lay upon the borders of Agrippa's kingdom, as also did Sogana and Seleucia. And these were both parts of Gaulonitis, for Sogana was part of that called the Upper Gaulonitis, as was Gamala of the Lower, while Seleucia was situated at the lake Semacawitis, which lake is 30 furlongs in breadth and 60 in length. Its marshes reach as far as the place Daphne, which in other respects is a delicious place, and hath such fountains as supply water to what is called Little Jordan, under the temple of the golden calf, where it is sent into the great Jordan. Footnote: Here we have the exact situation of Jeroboam's at the exit of the Little Jordan into the great Jordan, near the place called Daphne, but of old Dan. But Reland suspects Flint here we should read Dan instead of there being nowhere else mentioned of a place called Daphne. End footnote. Now Agrippa had united Sogana and Seleucia by leagues to himself at the very beginning of the revolt of the Romans, yet did not Gamala accede to them, but relied upon the difficulty of the place, which was greater than that of Jotapata, for it was situated upon a rough ridge of the high mountain, with a kind of neck in the middle. Where it begins to ascend, it lengthens itself, and declines as much downward before as behind, insomuch that it is like a camel in figure, from whence it is so named, although the people of the country do not pronounce it accurately. Both on the side and the face there are abrupt parts divided from the rest, and ending in vast deep valleys. Yet are the parts behind, where they are joined to the mountain, somewhat easier of ascent than the other, but then the people belonging to the place have cut an oblique ditch there, and made that hard to be ascended also. On its acclivity, which is straight, houses are built, and those very thick and close to one another. The city also hangs so strangely, that it looks as if it would fall down upon itself, so sharp is it at the top. It is exposed to the south, and its southern mount, which reaches to an immense height, was in the nature of a citadel to the city, and above that was a precipice, not walled about, but extending itself to an immense depth. There was also a spring of water within the wall, at the utmost limits of the city. 2. As this city was naturally hard to be taken, so had Josephus, by building a wall about it, made it still stronger, as also by ditches and mines under ground. The people that were in it were made more bold by the nature of the place than the people of Jotapata had been, but it had much fewer fighting men in it, and they had such a confidence in the situation of the place, that they thought the enemy could not be too many for them, for the city had been filled with those that had fled to it for safety, on account of its strength, on which account they had been able to resist those whom Agrippa sent to besiege it for 7 months together. 3. But Vespasian removed from Emmaus, where he had last pitched his camp before the city Tiberias, now Emmaus, if it may be interpreted, may be rendered a warm bath, for therein is a spring of warm water, useful for healing, and came to Gamala. Yet was its situation such that he was not able to encompass it all around with soldiers to watch it, but where the places were practicable, he set men to watch it, and seized upon the mountain which was over it. And as the legions, according to their usual custom, were fortifying their camp upon that mountain, he began to cast up banks at the bottom, at the part towards the east, where the highest tower of the whole city was, and where the 15th legion pitched their camp, while the 5th legion did duty over against the midst of the city, and whilst the 10th legion filled up the ditches in the valleys. Now at this time it was that as King Agrippa was come nigh the walls, and was endeavoring to speak to those that were on the walls about a surrender, he was hit with a stone on his right elbow by one of the slingers. He was then immediately surrounded with his own men. But the Romans were excited to set about the siege by their indignation on the king's account, and by their fear on their own account, as concluding that those men would omit no kinds of barbarity against foreigners and enemies, who were so enraged against one of their own nation, and one that advised them to nothing but what was for their own advantage. 4. Now when the banks were finished, which was done on the sudden, both by the multitude of hands and by their being accustomed to such work, they brought the machines. But Charis and Joseph, who were the most potent men in the city, set their armed men in order, though already in a fright, because they did not suppose that the city could hold out long, since they had not a sufficient quantity either of water or of other necessaries. However, these their leaders encouraged them, and brought them out upon the wall, and for a while indeed they drove away those that were bringing the machines. But when those machines threw darts and stones at them, they retired into the city. Then did the Romans bring battering rams to 3 several places, and made the wall shake and fall. They then poured in over the parts of the wall that were thrown down, with a mighty sound of trumpets and noise of armor, and with a shout of the soldiers, and brake in by force upon those that were in the city. But these men fell upon the Romans for some time, at their first entrance, and prevented their going any further, and with great courage beat them back. And the Romans were so overpowered by the greater multitude of the people, who beat them on every side, that they were obliged to run into the upper parts of the city. Whereupon the people turned about, and fell upon their enemies, who had attacked them, and thrust them down to the lower parts, and as they were distressed by the narrowness and difficulty of the place, slew them. And as these Romans could neither beat those back that were above them, nor escape the force of their own men that were forcing their way forward, they were compelled to fly into their enemies' houses, which were low, but these houses being thus full of soldiers, whose weight they could not bear, fell down suddenly. And when one house fell, it shook down a great many of those that were under it, as did those do to such as were under them. By this means a vast number of the Romans perished, for they were so terribly distressed, that although they saw the houses subsiding, they were compelled to leap upon the tops of them, so that a great many were ground to powder by these ruins, and a great many of those that got out from under them lost some of their limbs, but still a greater number were suffocated by the dust that arose from those ruins. The people of Gamala supposed this to be an assistance afforded them by God, and without regarding what damage they suffered themselves, they pressed forward and thrust the enemy upon the tops of their houses, and when they stumbled in the sharp and narrow streets, and were perpetually falling down, they threw their stones or darts at them, and slew them. Now the very ruins afforded them stones enough, and for iron weapons the dead men of the enemy's side afforded them what they wanted. For drawing the swords of those that were dead, they made use of them to dispatch such as were only half dead. Nay, there were a great number who, upon their falling down from the tops of the houses, stabbed themselves, and died after that manner. Nor indeed was it easy for those who were beaten back to fly away, for they were so unacquainted with the ways, and the dust was so thick, that they wandered about without knowing one another, and fell down dead among the crowd. 5. Those therefore that were able to find their ways out of the city retired. But now Vespasian always stayed among those that were hard set, for he was deeply affected with seeing the ruins of the city falling upon his army, and forgot to take care of his own preservation. He went up gradually towards the highest parts of the city before he was aware, and was left in the midst of dangers, having only a very few with him, for even his son Titus was not with him at that time, having been then sent to Syria to Mucianus. However, he thought it not safe to fly, nor did he esteem it a fit thing for him to do, but calling to mind the actions he had done from his youth, and recollecting his courage, as if he had been excited by a divine fury, he covered himself and those that were with him with their shields, and formed a testudo over both their bodies and their armor, and bore up against the enemy's attacks, who came running down from the top of the city. And without showing any dread at the multitude of the men or of their darts, he endured all, until the enemy took notice of that divine courage that was within him, and remitted of their attacks. And when they pressed less zealously upon him, he retired, though without showing his back to them till he was gotten out of the walls of the city. Now a great number of the Romans fell in this battle, among whom was Abudius, the Decurion, a man who appeared not only in this engagement wherein he fell, but everywhere, and in former engagements, to be of the truest courage, and one that had done very great mischief to the Jews. But there was a centurion whose name was Gallus, who, during this disorder being encompassed about, he and 10 other soldiers privately crept into the house of a certain person, where he heard them talking at supper what the people intended to do against the Romans or about themselves, for both the man himself and those with him were Syrians. So he got up in the night time, and cut all their throats, and escaped, together with his soldiers, to the Romans. 6. And now Vespasian comforted his army, which was much dejected by reflecting on their ill success, and because they had never before fallen into such a calamity, and besides this, because they were greatly ashamed that they had left their general alone in great dangers. As to what concerned himself, he avoided to say anything, that he might by no means seem to complain of it. But he said that, quote, "We ought to bear manfully what usually falls out in war, and this by considering what the nature of war is, and how it can never be that we must conquer without bloodshed on our own side. For there stands about us that fortune which is of its own nature mutable, that while they had killed so many 10,000s of the Jews, they had now paid their small share of the reckoning to fate. And as it is the part of weak people to be too much puffed up with good success, so is it the part of cowards to be too much affrighted at that which is ill, for the change from one to the other is sudden on both sides. And he is the best warrior who is of a sober mind under misfortunes, that he may continue in that temper, and cheerfully recover what had been lost formerly. And as for what had now happened, it was neither owing to their own effeminacy, nor to the valor of the Jews, but the difficulty of the place was the occasion of their advantage, and of our disappointment. Upon reflecting on which matter, one might blame your zeal as perfectly ungovernable. For when the enemy had retired to their highest fastnesses, you ought to have restrained yourselves, and not, by presenting yourselves at the top of the city, to be exposed to dangers. But upon your having obtained the lower parts of the city, you ought to have provoked those that had retired thither to a safe and settled battle. Whereas, in rushing so hastily upon victory, you took no care of your safety. But this incautiousness in war, and this madness of zeal, is not a Roman maxim. While we perform all that we attempt by skill and good order, that procedure is the part of barbarians, and is what the Jews chiefly support themselves by. We ought therefore to return to our own virtue, and to be rather angry than any longer dejected at this unlucky misfortune, and let every one seek for his own consolation from his own hand. For by this means he will avenge those that have been destroyed, and punish those that have killed them. For myself, I will endeavor, as I have now done, to go first before you against your enemies in every engagement, and to be the last that retires from it." 7. So Vespasian encouraged his army by this speech. But for the people of Gamala, it happened that they took courage for a little while, upon such great and unaccountable successes as they had had. But when they considered with themselves that they had now no hopes of any terms of accommodation, and reflecting upon it that they could not get away, and that their provisions began already to be short, they were exceedingly cast down, and their courage failed them. Yet did they not neglect what might be for their preservation, so far as they were able, but the most courageous among them guarded those parts of the wall that were beaten down, while the more infirm did the same to the rest of the wall that still remained round the city. And as the Romans raised their banks, and attempted to get into the city a second time, a great many of them fled out of the city through impracticable valleys, where no guards were placed, as also through subterraneous caverns, while those that were afraid of being caught, and for that reason stayed in the city, perished for want of food. For what food they had was brought together from all quarters, and reserved for the fighting men. 8. And these were the hard circumstances that the people of Gamala were in. But now Vespasian went about other work by the by during the siege, and that was to subdue those that had seized upon Mount Tabor, a place that lies in the middle between the great plain and Scythopolis, whose top is elevated as high as 30 furlongs, and is hardly to be ascended on its north side. Its top is a plain of 26 furlongs, and all encompassed with a wall. Footnote: These numbers in Josephus of 30 furlongs ascent to the top of Mount Tabor, whether we estimate it by winding and gradual, or by the perpendicular altitude, and of 26 furlongs circumference upon the top, as also 15 furlongs for this ascent in Polybius, with Geminus's perpendicular altitude of almost 14 furlongs, here noted by Dr. Hudson, do none of them agree with the authentic testimony of Mr. Mondrell, an eyewitness, who says that he was not an hour in getting up to the top of this Mount Tabor, and that the area of the top is an oval of about 2 furlongs in length, and 1 in breadth. So I rather suppose Josephus wrote 3 furlongs for the ascent or altitude instead of 30, and 6 furlongs for the circumference at the top instead of 26, since a mountain of only 3 furlongs perpendicular altitude may easily require near an hour's ascent, and the circumference of an oval of the foregoing quantity is near 6 furlongs. Nor certainly could such a vast circumference as 26 furlongs, or 3 miles and a quarter, at that height, be encompassed with a wall, including a trench and other fortifications, perhaps those still remaining, in the small interval of 40 days, as Josephus here says they were by himself. Now Josephus erected this so long a wall in 40 days' time, and furnished it with other materials, and with water from below, for the inhabitants only made use of rain-water. As therefore there was a great multitude of people gotten together upon this mountain, Vespasian sent Placidus with 600 horsemen thither. Now, as it was impossible for him to ascend the mountain, he invited many of them to peace, by the offer of his right hand for their security, and of his intercession for them. Accordingly they came down, but with a treacherous design, as well as he had the like treacherous design upon them on the other side. For Placidus spoke mildly to them, as aiming to take them, when he got them into the plain. They also came down, as complying with his proposals, but it was in order to fall upon him when he was not aware of it. However, Placidus's stratagem was too hard for theirs, for when the Jews began to fight, he pretended to run away, and when they were in pursuit of the Romans, he enticed them a great way along the plain, and then made his horsemen turn back, whereupon he beat them, and slew a great number of them, and cut off the retreat of the rest of the multitude, and hindered their return. So they left Tabor, and fled to Jerusalem, while the people of the country came to terms with him, for their water failed them, and so they delivered up the mountain and themselves to Placidus. 9. But of the people of Gamala, those that were of the bolder sort fled away and hid themselves, while the more infirm perished by famine. But the men of war sustained the siege till the 22nd day of the month Hyperbaratons, Tisri, when 3 soldiers of the 15th legion, about the morning watch, got under a high tower that was near them, and undermined it, without making any noise. Nor when they either came to it, which was in the night time, nor when they were under it, did those that guarded it perceive them. These soldiers then upon their coming avoided making a noise, and when they had rolled away 5 of its strongest stones, they went away hastily, whereupon the tower fell down on a sudden, with a very great noise, and its guard fell headlong with it, so that those that kept guard at other places were under such disturbance that they ran away. The Romans also slew many of those that ventured to oppose them, among whom was Joseph, who was slain by a dart, as he was running away over that part of the wall that was broken down. But as those that were in the city were greatly affrighted at the noise, they ran hither and thither, and a great consternation fell upon them, as though all the enemy had fallen in at once upon them. Then it was that Charis, who was ill and under the physician's hands, gave up the ghost, the fear that he was in greatly contributing to make his distemper fatal to him. But the Romans so well remembered their former ill success, that they did not enter the city till the 23rd day of the forementioned month. 10. At which time Titus, who was now returned, out of the indignation he had at the destruction the Romans had undergone while he was absent, took 200 chosen horsemen and some footmen with him, and entered without noise into the city. Now as the watch perceived that he was coming, they made a noise, and betook themselves to their arms. And as that his entrance was presently known to those that were in the city, some of them caught hold of their children and their wives, and drew them after them, and fled away to the citadel, with lamentations and cries, while others of them went to meet Titus, and were killed perpetually. But so many of them as were hindered from running up to the citadel, not knowing what in the world to do, fell among the Roman guards, while the groans of those that were killed were prodigiously great everywhere, and blood ran down all over the lower parts of the city from the upper. But then Vespasian himself came to his assistance against those that had fled to the citadel, and brought his whole army with him. Now this upper part of the city was every way rocky, and difficult of ascent, and elevated to a vast altitude, and very full of people on all sides, and encompassed with precipices, whereby the Jews cut off those that came up to them, and did much mischief to others by their darts, and the large stones which they rolled down upon them, while they were themselves so high that the enemy's darts could hardly reach them. However, there arose such a divine storm against them as was instrumental to their destruction. This carried the Roman darts upon them, and made those which they threw turn back, and drove them obliquely away from them. Nor could the Jews indeed stand upon their precipices by reason of the violence of the wind, having nothing that was stable to stand upon, nor could they see those that were ascending up to them. So the Romans got up and surrounded them, and some they slew before they could defend themselves, and others as they were delivering up themselves. And the remembrance of those that were slain at their former entrance into the city increased their rage against them now. A great number also of those who were surrounded on every side, and despaired of escaping, threw their children and their wives, and themselves also, down the precipices, into the valley beneath, which, near the citadel, had been dug hollow to a vast depth. But so it happened, that the anger of the Romans appeared not to be so extravagant as was the madness of those that were now taken, while the Romans slew but 4,000, whereas the number of those that had thrown themselves down was found to be 5,000. Nor did any one escape except 2 women, who were the daughters of Philip, and Philip himself was the son of a certain eminent man called Jacomus, who had been general of King Agrippa's army. And these did therefore escape, because they lay concealed from the rage of the Romans when the city was taken, for otherwise they spared not so much as the infants, of which many were flung down by them from the citadel. And thus was Gamala taken on the 23rd day of the month Hyperbaratons, Tisri, whereas the city had first revolted on the 24th day of the month Gorpaius, Elul.
Book 4, Chapter 2 of the War of the Jews. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Chapter 2. The surrender of Gishala while John flies away from it, Jerusalem. Now no place of Galilee remained to be taken, but the small city of Gishala, whose multitude yet were desirous of peace, for they were generally husbandmen, and always applied themselves to cultivate the fruits of the earth. However, there were a great number that belonged to the band of robbers, that were already corrupted, and had crept in among them, and some of the governing part of the citizens were sick of the same distemper. It was John the son of a certain man, whose name was Levi, that drew them into this rebellion, and encouraged them in it. He was a cunning knave, and of a temper that could put up various shapes, very rash in expecting great things, and very sagacious in bringing about what he hoped for. It was known to be everybody that he was fond of war, in order to thrust himself into authority, and the seditious part of the people of Gischala were put under his management, by whose means the populace, who seemed ready to send ambassadors in order to surrender, waited for the coming of the Romans in battle array. Vespasian sent against them Titus with 1,000 horsemen, but withdrew the 10th legion to Sycophilus, while he returned to Caesarea with the 2 other legions, that he might allow them to refresh themselves after their long and hard campaign, thinking withal that the plenty which was in those cities would improve their bodies and their spirits against the difficulties they were to go through afterwards. For he saw there would be occasions for great pains about Jerusalem, which was not yet taken, because it was the royal city and the principal city of the whole nation, and because those that had run away from the war in other places got all together thither. It was also naturally strong, and the walls that were built round it made him not a little concerned about it. Moreover, he esteemed the men that were in it to be so courageous and bold, that even without the consideration of the walls it would be hard to subdue them, for which reason he took care of and exercised his soldiers beforehand for the work, as they do wrestlers before they begin their undertaking. Now Titus, as he rode out to Gischala, found it would be easy for him to take the city upon the first onset, but knew withal that if he took it by force, the multitude would be destroyed by the soldiers without mercy. So he was rather desirous the city might be surrendered up to him on terms. Accordingly, when he saw the wall full of those men that were of the corrupted party, he said to them that he could not but wonder what it was they depended on, when they alone stayed to fight the Romans, after every other city was taken by them, especially when they have seen cities much better fortified than theirs is overthrown by a single attack upon them. While as many as have entrusted themselves to the security of the Romans' right hand, which he now offers to them, without regarding their former insolence, do enjoy their own possessions in safety, for that while they had hopes of recovering their liberty, they might be pardoned, but that their continuance still in their opposition, when they saw that to the impossible, was inexcusable. For this, if they will not comply with such humane offers and right hands for security, they should have experience of such a war as would spare nobody, and should soon be made sensible that their wall would be a little trifle when battered by the Roman machines, in depending on which they demonstrate themselves to be the only Galileans that were no better than arrogant slaves and captives. Now none of the populace durst not only make a reply, but durst not so much as get upon the wall, for it was all taken up by the robbers, who were also the guards of the gates, in order to prevent any of the rest from going out, in order to propose terms of submission, and from receiving any of the horsemen into the city. But John returned Titus this answer, that for himself he was content to hearken to his proposals, and that he would either persuade or force those that refused him. Yet he said that Titus ought to have such regard to the Jewish law as to grant him leave to celebrate that day, which was the 7th day of the week, on which it was unlawful not only to remove their arms, but even to treat of peace also. And that even the Romans were not ignorant how the period of the 7th day was among them a cessation from all labors, and that he who should compel them to transgress the law about the day would be equally guilt with those that were compelled to transgress it, and that this delay could be of no advantage to him. For why should anybody think of doing anything in the night, unless it was to fly away, which he might prevent by placing his camp round about them, and that they should think it a great point gained, if they might not be obliged to transgress the laws of their country, and that it would be a right thing for him, who designed to grant them peace without their expectation of such a favor, to preserve the laws of those they saved inviolable. Thus did the man put a trick upon Titus, not so much of the regard to the 7th day as to his own preservation, for he was afraid lest he should be quite deserted if the city should not be taken, and had these hopes of life in that night, and in his fight therein. Now this was the work of God, who therefore preserved this John, that he might bring on the destruction of Jerusalem, as also it was his work that Titus was prevailed with by this pretense for a delay, and that he pitched his camp further off the city of Sidessa, This Cydessa was a strong Mediterranean village of Tyrannies, which always hated and made war against the Jews. It had also a great number of inhabitants and was well fortified, which made it a proper place for such as were enemies to the Jewish nation. Now in the night time, when John saw the opportunity was no Roman guard about the city, he seized the opportunity directly, and taking with him not only the armed men that were about him, but a considerable number of those that had little to do, together with their families, he fled to Jerusalem. And indeed, though the man was making haste to get away, and was tormented with fears of being a captive, or of losing his life, yet did he prevail with himself to take out of the city along with him a multitude of women and children, as far as 20 furlongs. But there he left them as he proceeded further on his journey, where those that were left behind made sad lamentations. For the farther every one of them who came from his own people, the nearer they thought themselves to be to their enemies. They also affrighted themselves with the thought that those who would carry them into captivity were just at hand, and still turned themselves back at the mere noise they made themselves in this hasty fight. As if those from whom they fled were just upon them, many also of them missed their ways, and the earnestness of such as aimed to outgo the rest threw down many of the time. And indeed there was a miserable destruction made of the women and children, while some of them took courage to call their husbands and kinsmen back, and to beseech them with the bitterest lamentations to stay from them. But John's exhortation, who cried out to them to save themselves and fly away, prevailed. He said also that if the Romans should seize upon those whom they left behind, they would be revenged on them for it. So this multitude that ran thus away was dispersed abroad, according as such, and each of them was able to run, one faster or slower than another. Now on the next day Titus came to the wall to make the agreement, whereupon the people opened their gates to him, and came out to him with their children and wives, and made exclamations of joy to him, as to one that had been their benefactor, and had delivered the city out of the custody. They also informed him of John's flight, and besought him to spare them, and to come in and bring the rest of those that were for innovations to punishment. But Titus, not so much regarding the supplications of the people, sent part of his horsemen to pursue after John, but they could not overtake him, for he was gotten to Jerusalem before. They also slew 6,000 of the women and children who went out with him, but returned back and brought with them almost 3,000. However, Titus was greatly displeased that he had not been able to bring this John, who had deluded him, to punishment, and yet he had captives enough, as well as the corrupted part of the city, to satisfy his anger when it missed of John. So he entered the city in the midst of exclamations of joy, and when he had given orders to the soldiers to pull down a small part of the wall, as of a city taken in war, he repressed those that had disturbed the city rather by threatenings than by executions. For he thought that many would accuse innocent persons out of their own private animosities and quarrels, if he should attempt to distinguish those that were worthy of punishment from the rest, and that it was better to let a guilty person alone in his fears than to destroy him any one that did not deserve it. For that probably such a one might be taught prudence by the fear of the punishment he had deserved, and have a shame upon him for his former offences, when he had been forgiven, but that the punishment of such as have been once put to death could not be retrieved. However, he placed a garrison in the city for its security, by which means he should restrain those that were for innovations, and should leave those that were peaceably disposed in greater security. And thus was all Galillee taken, but this not till after it had cost the Romans much pain before it could be taken by them.